Before we begin tonight's investigation, I want to give a huge shout out to Michael and Norman for suggesting this topic. Your ideas help truly shape this channel. If you're enjoying this documentary and finding value in the research we do here, please consider using your hype points on this video. It genuinely helps the channel more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep diving deep into these fascinating mysteries. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're winding down for the night or just starting your day. But only if you want to share, no pressure. Now, let's descend into one of the most controversial construction projects in American history. Marin Cole had been working late in her home office in downtown Denver, reviewing zoning permits for a residential development project, when her computer chimed with the notification. The glow of her monitor was the only light in the room, casting long shadows across walls decorated with framed architectural drawings and her master's degree from the University of Colorado. She almost didn't open it. After 15 years as an urban planner, she had learned to be cautious about late-night emails from unknown senders. But something about the timing felt deliberate, as if whoever sent it knew she would be awake, knew she worked these late hours. The sender line read only, "A friend." No subject line, no message body, just a single attachment. Marin's hand hovered over the mouse. She thought about her father, who had been a structural engineer before his death 3 years ago. He'd taught her to trust her instincts, but also to verify everything. "Buildings don't lie," he used to say. "Paper trails always tell the truth if you know how to read them." Against her better judgment, she clicked it. The image that filled her screen was a blueprint, aged and slightly faded, with the unmistakable header, "Denver International Airport, Sub-Level Construction Plans, January 1993. Marin had seen plenty of DIA blueprints in her career. The airport's construction history was part of local legend, taught in planning courses as a cautionary tale about budget overruns and project mismanagement. But this blueprint showed something she had never seen before. Most people knew that Denver International Airport had underground levels. The automated baggage system that famously failed occupied much of the subterranean space. Public tours occasionally took visitors through the abandoned tunnels, showing off the miles of empty conveyor belts and sorting stations that cost hundreds of millions of dollars and never worked properly. Those tunnels occupied sub-levels 1 through 3. This blueprint showed a sub-level 6, and it extended miles beyond the airport's runways, spreading like roots beneath the eastern plains of Colorado. Massive rectangular chambers were labelled with clinical precision: Environmental Control Station 12, Biological Storage Wing C, Containment Observation Gallery. The technical specifications were extraordinary. Each chamber had ventilation systems more complex than hospital operating rooms. The walls were marked with thickness measurements that suggested bunker-level construction, power systems redundant enough for a military installation. In the bottom right corner, written in faded red ink, were 4 words that made Marin's hands go cold. They built much more than an airport. Find what's beneath. She stared at the screen for nearly 10 minutes, her analytical mind racing through possibilities. It could be a hoax. Conspiracy theorists had been making wild claims about Denver International Airport since before it opened. The internet was full of fabricated documents and photoshopped images designed to fuel paranoia. But something about this blueprint felt different. The technical specifications were too detailed, too precise. The handwriting in the margins matched the style of construction notes from that era, the kind her father had used. The paper grain visible in the scan showed authentic aging, with water stains in the corners that suggested decades of storage in less than ideal conditions. Marin zoomed in on various sections, studying the architectural symbols and measurements. Whoever created this document understood structural engineering at a professional level. The load-bearing calculations, ventilation shaft placements, and electrical grid layouts all followed proper protocols. More than that, they followed protocols from the early 90s, before computer-aided design had standardized everything. These were hand-drawn specifications with the small imperfections and personal touches that marked genuine period documents. If this was a fake, it was the most sophisticated one she'd ever encountered. She saved the file to 3 different locations, printed a physical copy, and spent the rest of the night researching everything she could find about Denver International Airport's construction history. The coffee pot emptied twice. Dawn began to grey her windows, and somewhere in those early morning hours, Marin made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find out if Sublevel 6 was real. The question was whether she was prepared for what that truth might cost. Part 2. The airport that shouldn't exist. Denver International Airport opened on February 28, 1995, 16 months behind schedule and billions of dollars over budget. The official story blamed the delays on the automated baggage system, which had been plagued with technical failures from the beginning. But as Marin dug deeper into the construction records over the next several days, she found inconsistencies that troubled her professional instincts. The airport sits on 53 square miles of land, making it one of the largest airport properties in the world by land area. That's bigger than Manhattan. For a city the size of Denver, the scale seemed excessive, particularly given that the old Stapleton International Airport had been handling traffic adequately. She pulled up satellite imagery, comparing the footprint of Denver International to other major hubs. Chicago O'Hare, one of the busiest airports in the world, occupied less than 8 square miles. Los Angeles International, serving a metropolitan area 3 times Denver's size, sat on just over 4 square miles. Why did Denver need 53? The official explanation was that city planners wanted room for expansion. Fair enough. But why choose a location so far from the city centre? The new airport sat 25 miles northeast of downtown Denver, a significant inconvenience for travellers compared to Stapleton's 6-mile distance. Marin made a list of contractors from public records, cross-referencing names against business registries and construction union databases. She spent the next 3 days tracking down former contractors who had worked on the airport's construction. Most were retired now, in their 60s and 70s, scattered across Colorado and neighbouring states. She presented herself as a researcher, working on a book about major infrastructure projects, which wasn't entirely untrue. She had been writing case studies for professional journals for years, but this research felt different, personal, as if she were following a trail her father would have wanted her to pursue. The first person she interviewed was Thomas Burkhart, who had supervised concrete work on the underground levels. They met at a diner in Aurora, one of those classic American places with red vinyl booths and a smell of coffee and bacon grease that had seeped into the walls over decades. Moran arrived early, choosing a booth near the back with a clear view of the entrance. Thomas arrived exactly on time, a heavy-set man with weathered hands that spoke of 40 years in construction. His eyes were cautious, the way people get when they've learned that talking about certain things carries consequences. He ordered coffee and pie, studied Marin for a long moment, then said, "What do you really want to know?" Marin decided honesty was the best approach. She pulled out a copy of the blueprint and slid it across the table. "The truth about what you built down there." Thomas stirred sugar into his coffee, watching the liquid swirl. He didn't touch the blueprint, didn't even look at it directly, but she could see the recognition in his eyes. "We poured concrete for sections we never saw completed," he said finally, his voice low. "Whole wings got sealed off before we could finish the work. They'd bring in different crews who didn't talk to each other. Every team had its own section, own access point, own supervisor. That's unusual. It's unheard of. On a normal project, you've got coordination, you've got continuity. Guys from different teams eat lunch together, complain about the same problems, compare notes. This was compartmentalized like military work. Nobody saw the full picture. Nobody was supposed to." He took a sip of coffee, grimaced as if it were bitter. "I've been in this business since I was 18. Worked on hospitals, government buildings, even some Department of Energy facilities out west. But I've never seen anything like the security protocols on that airport. The deep sections especially. Did you ever see blueprints for Sublevel 6? Thomas went very still. His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "Who told you about Sublevel 6? "So it exists." He set down the cup carefully as if it might shatter. "I never said that." "But you just confirmed it." Thomas looked around the diner, checking the other customers. An elderly couple near the window, a trucker at the counter, a waitress refilling coffee, no one paying attention to them. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. There were sections we weren't allowed to enter, whole areas cordoned off with military-style security, men in suits watching everything, not airport authority, not city inspectors, federal people. They never talked to us directly, just stood there, observing, taking notes, sometimes photographing us while we worked. What were they building? I don't know, but I can tell you what we built to access it. Elevator shafts that went down farther than any airport needs. Reinforced walls thick enough for nuclear bunkers. Ventilation systems with filtration protocols I'd only seen in biohazard facilities. He pulled out his wallet and dropped cash on the table. I've got grandkids, miss. 3 of them. I'd like to keep seeing them. Some things you're better off not knowing. Mr. Burkhart, please, just tell me. You want to know what scares me most. He was standing now, preparing to leave. It's not what they built. It's that after all these years, nobody's asked, nobody's investigated. Every journalist who gets close to this story suddenly drops it. Every researcher who digs too deep finds a new job somewhere else. That tells you something, doesn't it? About how important it is to certain people that nobody knows what's down there. He left without touching his pie. Marin sat in the booth for another 20 minutes, staring at the cold coffee in front of her. Through the window she could see the mountains to the west, the Front Range rising against the morning sky. Somewhere out there, 25 miles to the northeast, Denver International Airport sprawled across the plains like a secret waiting to be uncovered. She had 2 more contractors to interview, but Thomas Burkhart's fear had told her more than any blueprint could. Whatever was beneath that airport, people had been keeping it hidden for 30 years, and they were still keeping it hidden now. Part 3. The Dedication Stone. The next day, Marin visited Denver International Airport herself. She parked in long-term parking, noting the massive lot that seemed to stretch forever across the plains. The terminal rose in the distance, its white tensile fabric roof designed to resemble snow-capped mountains, or, as some conspiracy theorists claimed, the tents of a massive encampment. She took the train to the main terminal, moving through crowds of travellers with her phone camera ready. She wasn't sure what she was looking for exactly, but she knew the airport's peculiarities were hiding in plain sight. The first stop was the Dedication Stone. It sat in the Great Hall, near the south end of the main terminal, mounted prominently on the floor. Most travellers walked right past it without a second glance, rolling their suitcases over the polished surface, focused on reaching their gates. But Marin knelt down and read the inscription carefully. New World Airport Commission. Below that, a dedication date, March 19th, 1994, and in the bottom corner, unmistakably, the square and compass symbol of Freemasonry. Marin had read about this stone in various conspiracy forums, but seeing it in person sent a chill down her spine. The New World Airport Commission sounded official, important. But according to every public record she could find, no such organisation existed. Not in Colorado, not in federal registries, nowhere. So who commissioned this dedication stone? And why did it credit a fictional organisation? She took multiple photographs from different angles, adjusting for the lighting that streamed through the terminal's windows. Around her, travellers continued their journeys, oblivious to the mystery beneath their feet. A child ran past, chasing a rolling ball. A pilot in uniform walked by, checking his phone. Normal airport life. Utterly mundane. But nothing about this place was mundane. She sat on a nearby bench and started researching on her phone. The Freemason connection was well documented in conspiracy circles, often dismissed as coincidental. Many public buildings had Freemason symbols. It didn't necessarily mean anything sinister. The Freemasons had been involved in construction and civic projects throughout American history, but combined with everything else, it formed a pattern. An airport built far from the city centre, massively over budget, with underground construction that nobody seemed to understand, dedicated by an organisation that didn't exist, and marked with symbols of a secret society. Either this was an elaborate series of coincidences, or something very deliberate was happening here. Marin stood and began walking through the terminal. studying its architecture with new eyes. The Great Hall was massive, with ceilings that soared overhead and windows that flooded the space with natural light. Beautiful in its way, but also excessive, wasteful even. Why build something so large for a city this size? Unless the terminal was designed for purposes beyond commercial aviation, unless it was meant to accommodate something else entirely. Part 4. The Murals of Prophecy. The murals were impossible to miss. Located in the main terminal, the massive paintings by artist Leo Tangumer had become infamous in conspiracy communities. Marin stood in front of them now, trying to understand what she was seeing. The first mural, titled "Children of the World Dream of Peace," showed scenes of destruction that seemed anything but peaceful. Burning forests consumed ancient trees, flames rendered in vivid orange and red that seemed to leap from the wall. Dead animals lay in heaps, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions. Children in caskets, their faces pale and lifeless, lay in rows that stretched into the distance. Above them all, a massive soldier wearing a gas mask loomed over the devastation, holding a rifle and a curved sword. The colours were vivid, almost violent in their intensity. Behind the soldier, crowds of people fled in terror, their faces twisted in anguish, their bodies pressed together in desperate flight. The soldier's gas mask was the most disturbing element. It was rendered with technical precision, every detail carefully painted. The rubber seals, the filter cartridge, the reflective lenses that showed no humanity behind them. This wasn't an abstract representation of war. This was a specific piece of military equipment, painted from reference. Marin moved closer, studying the details. In the background, barely visible among the chaos, buildings burned. And one of those buildings had a distinctive shape. It took her several minutes to recognize it, but once she did, she couldn't unsee it. It was the main terminal of Denver International Airport itself. The second mural depicted transformation. The same soldier from the first painting now lay defeated, broken. His gas mask was shattered, his weapons transformed into plowshares. Children from various nations gathered around, holding implements that had been beaten from instruments of war into tools of peace. Doves flew overhead, their wings spread against a sky of impossible blue. The world bloomed with life and colour, flowers growing from ground that had been scorched and barren. The official interpretation was that these murals showed humanity overcoming war and oppression, moving from darkness into light. A message of hope. But standing in front of them, Marin felt anything but hopeful. The level of detail was disturbing. The dead children looked too real, their features too specific. The environmental destruction showed particular types of collapse. Chemical contamination indicated by the yellow-green tint to the smoke. Biological warfare suggested by the protective equipment worn by the soldier. Ecological disaster visible in the way the trees had been stripped of leaves before burning. These weren't abstract representations of war. They were specific scenarios. Marin took dozens of photographs, documenting every detail. She noticed other travellers stopping to look, some taking quick snapshots with their phones, others moving past with expressions of discomfort. A mother hurried her children along, not wanting them to see. A teenager laughed, making jokes about the creepy artwork. But Marin saw something none of them did. She saw a timeline, a narrative. The murals weren't just showing the past and future of humanity. They were showing a sequence of events. First panel, catastrophe. Second panel, recovery. But what happened between those two moments? What was the transition? She had managed to track down Leo Tanguma's contact information through the artist's gallery in Denver. He was elderly now, living in retirement, but he had agreed to a phone conversation. "People have been asking me about those paintings for 30 years, he said, when she called later that evening. His voice carried the weariness of someone who had answered the same questions too many times. I painted what I was commissioned to paint. The themes were provided to me. Provided by whom? The airport authority, or at least that's who I thought I was working with. Looking back, I'm not entirely sure. The instructions were very specific, very detailed. They wanted particular imagery, particular symbols. They gave me reference photographs for some elements, the gas mask, for instance. They were very insistent that I get every detail correct. Did they explain why? They said it was about humanity's journey, war and peace, destruction and renewal, the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. But honestly, I didn't fully understand what I was painting until it was finished. Some of the symbolism, the specific details they insisted on, I couldn't tell you what they meant. The burning building in the background, Marin said. The one that looks like the airport terminal. Was that in their instructions? There was a long pause. I don't recall. It's been so many years. But now that you mention it, yes. I think they provided a photograph of that element. They were very specific about the architecture. Did that strike you as odd, having the airport shown in a scene of destruction? At the time, no. I was focused on the larger themes, on making the work powerful and meaningful. It was only later, after the murals were installed and I saw them in context, that I began to wonder. Why would you commission artwork showing your own building being destroyed? What message were they trying to send? What do you think they were trying to say? Leo was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost reluctant. I think there are people who knew exactly what they wanted those murals to say, and I think they chose me because I could paint what they described without asking too many questions. I was young, I needed the work, I believed in the message of peace overcoming war. I didn't realise until much later that I might have been part of something bigger, something I still don't fully understand. Do you think the murals are a warning? I think they're a story, but whether it's a story of what has been, what could be, or what will be, I honestly can't say. After the call ended, Marin returned to the airport. It was evening now, the terminal quieter as the day's flights wound down. She stood in front of the murals for another hour, photographing every detail as the light changed, as shadows deepened in the corners of the painted scenes. One detail caught her attention that she hadn't noticed before. In the second mural, the one showing peace and renewal, the children held a dove between them. And behind that dove, barely visible in the background, was a shape, a rectangle. When she zoomed in with her phone camera, she could make out details. A door, sealed shut, with a symbol painted on its surface. The same symbol that marked the dedication stone, the square and compass of Freemasonry. The children in the mural weren't just celebrating peace, they were standing guard over something, protecting it, or perhaps keeping it contained. Part 5. The runway pattern. That evening, back in her apartment, Marin pulled up satellite imagery of Denver International Airport on her laptop. From ground level, the airport looked like any other modern transportation hub, but from above, the runway configuration revealed something unusual. The 6 runways formed a pattern that, depending on how you looked at it, resembled a swastika. She traced the lines with her finger on the screen, following the angles. Runway 16, right 34 left, ran northeast to southwest. Runway 16 left 34 right parallel to it. Runway 725 crossed them, running east to west. And the 3 shorter runways filled in the spaces, creating angles that definitely formed a shape that made her uncomfortable. Official explanations attributed this to wind efficiency. Denver's weather patterns required runways positioned to handle crosswinds from multiple directions. The configuration was purely functional, designed by computer models to maximize operational capacity under challenging wind conditions. The front range created turbulent airflows, downdrafts, sudden shifts. The runways needed to accommodate approaches from any direction. But Marin had studied airport design in graduate school. She knew dozens of major airports around the world, all dealing with complex wind patterns, and none of them had runway configurations that looked anything like this. She spent hours comparing DIA's layout to other airports. Hong Kong, notorious for its challenging winds. Wellington, New Zealand, one of the windiest airports in the world. Chicago O'Hare, dealing with lake effects and prairie weather. None of them had patterns like this. She reached out to a former FAA airport planner named Richard Voss, who had worked on airport designs throughout the western United States in the 80s and 90s. It took several calls to track him down, but she finally found him living in retirement in Boulder, a modest ranch house with a stunning view of the Flatirons. They met on a Saturday afternoon. Richard was in his early 70s, thin and sharp-eyed, with the careful speech pattern of someone who chose his words deliberately. He invited her into a living room lined with bookshelves filled with technical manuals and aviation history. Photographs on the walls showed airports under construction, Richard in various hard hats and safety vests, shaking hands with officials whose faces Marin didn't recognise. The runway pattern, he said, studying the satellite images Marin had brought, spreading them across his coffee table. Yes, I remember the controversy when these designs were first proposed. There were concerns about the optics, about what people might think when they saw this from above. But it was built anyway. It was built exactly as specified, despite objections, despite alternative designs that would have worked just as well for wind coverage. He traced his finger across one of the runways. This configuration isn't just about wind patterns, it's a directional code. What do you mean? Richard stood and retrieved a file folder from his study. Inside were yellow documents, old FAA memos, design specifications from decades ago. During the Cold War, certain airports were designated as emergency contingency sites, places where government aircraft could land if primary locations were compromised. These airports had specific runway patterns that could be recognised from high altitude, even without radio communication. Visual codes that pilots could identify and understand the purpose of the facility from the air. He pulled out one document showing similar runway patterns at various military installations. You see these angles? They're not random. They're navigational aids for pilots who need to identify secure locations quickly. You're saying Denver International Airport was designed as an emergency government landing site. Richard looked at her carefully, as if weighing how much to reveal. I'm saying the runway pattern serves multiple purposes, and one of those purposes has nothing to do with commercial aviation. Look here. He pointed to a section of the pattern. These angles would be visible from 50 miles away to a pilot at altitude. They'd know immediately that this facility had specific capabilities, specific resources. Why haven't you spoken about this before? Because I like my quiet life, Miss Cole. I like watching the sunset from my porch and visiting my grandchildren. There are some truths that cost more than they're worth. He handed back the satellite images. But I'll tell you this. When I heard they were building that airport so far from the city, with so much underground construction, with security protocols I'd never seen on a civilian project, I knew something else was going on, and I decided I didn't want to know what it was. But you kept the documents. Insurance, he said simply, in case someone ever asked the right questions, in case someone needed to know the truth. He walked to his window, looking out at the mountains. You're not the first person to come asking about Denver International, but you're the first one who's gotten this far. The others, they either stopped digging or... He trailed off. Or what? Or they had accidents. Strange coincidences. Job offers in other cities that were too good to refuse. That's how they operate. They don't threaten directly. They just make continuing more trouble than it's worth. Marin felt a chill run through her. Who are they? Richard turned from the window. That's the question, isn't it? And I honestly don't know the full answer. Federal agencies, military intelligence, contractors with security clearances so high they don't have names. People who believe that national security justifies any level of secrecy. Maybe they're right. Maybe what's beneath that airport needs to stay hidden. Or maybe transparency and truth matter more than security, he shrugged. That's not for me to decide. I'm just an old airport planner who wants to see his grandchildren grow up. Part 6. The tunnels that failed. The automated baggage system was legendary in engineering circles as one of the most expensive failures in infrastructure history. Designed to transport luggage through miles of underground tunnels, using computer-controlled carts travelling up to 20 miles per hour, the system was supposed to revolutionise airport operations. Instead, it mangled luggage, crashed constantly, and was abandoned before the airport even opened. The official cost, $400 million, wasted. But Marin had found something interesting in the construction records. The tunnel system was far more extensive than necessary for a baggage system, and many sections of the tunnels had never been used for baggage at all. She managed to gain access to the maintenance areas through a contact in airport operations, a technician named James who owed her a favour from a previous consulting project. She had helped his department with an efficiency analysis 2 years ago, saving them from budget cuts. He agreed to give her an unofficial tour of the abandoned sections. "This is completely off the record," he said when they met at the service entrance early one morning. "If anyone asks, you were never here." "Understood." They entered through a service elevator in Terminal A, descending past the active baggage levels into older, darker sections. The elevator car was industrial, scarred with years of use, smelling of metal and grease. It descended for what felt like a long time, the numbers on the panel counting down: 3, 4, 5. When the doors opened, they stepped into a different world. The air smelled of concrete dust and stale ventilation. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shadows that seemed to move. The temperature was cooler than above, the humidity different. Marin could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance, an irregular rhythm that echoed through empty spaces. Most of this was supposed to be demolished after the system failed, James explained as they walked through a wide concrete corridor. But demolition costs money, and there was no real reason to remove it. So it just sits here, miles of empty tunnel. The scale was staggering. These weren't narrow maintenance crawl spaces. They were wide enough to drive trucks through, tall enough to require safety railings along the upper walkways. The walls were reinforced concrete, far thicker than necessary for a baggage system. Marin ran her hand along the surface, feeling the smooth finish of professional construction. "Why would they overbuild like this?" she asked. James shrugged. "Official answer is they expected future expansion, but between you and me, this looks more like bunker construction than tunnel construction. See these walls? They're built to withstand serious pressure. I've seen specs on some of these sections. The concrete is reinforced with enough rebar to handle a building collapse above it. You don't need that for baggage carts." They walked for nearly 20 minutes, passing through section after section of identical corridors. The tunnels branched, intersected, formed a maze that would be impossible to navigate without the colour-coded markers painted at intervals on the walls. Red for north-south corridors, blue for east-west, green for service tunnels. But there were other colours too. Yellow markers that James avoided. White markers that led to locked gates. "What do those colours mean?" Marin asked. "Yellow is sections that are still active for utilities. Power conduits, water mains, that kind of thing. White is restricted access. Beyond my clearance." "How much of this tunnel system is restricted?" "More than half, maybe 2/3. I've been working here for 8 years, and I've only seen maybe 30% of what's down here." They reached a junction where 3 tunnels met. James stopped, checking his phone as if confirming their location. "This is as far as I'm cleared to go," he said. "Beyond here you need special authorization, Homeland Security level clearance, for abandoned baggage tunnels. That's what I said when I first started working here. Never got an answer that made sense." He pointed down the leftmost corridor, which disappeared into darkness beyond the range of the fluorescent lights. "That tunnel runs east, way past the runways, goes for miles according to the old maps, but it's not on any current airport schematics. It's like they erased it from the official records." "What's down there?" "No idea, and I don't ask. People who ask too many questions about the deep sections tend to get reassigned, or fired." He checked his phone again. "We should head back. Shift change happens soon, and I'd rather not explain why I'm down here with an outside consultant." Marin took photographs of everything, noting the junction point on her mental map of the airport. The tunnel James indicated aligned almost perfectly with the sub-level 6 sections from the anonymous blueprint. As they walked back toward the elevator, she heard something. A sound like voices, distant and muffled, coming from one of the restricted corridors. She stopped, straining to listen. "Don't," James said quietly. "Just keep walking." "Did you hear that?" "I hear lots of things down here, and I've learned that the smart move is to pretend I didn't." He kept walking, and after a moment Marin followed. But she couldn't shake the sound of those voices, because they hadn't sounded like maintenance workers or security guards. They had sounded urgent, almost frightened, as if something in those tunnels was worth being afraid of. Part 7. The Men Who Went Missing. Back in her office, Marin began compiling a list of key contractors who had worked on the airport's underground construction. The list was surprisingly difficult to assemble. Many records were incomplete or had been archived in ways that made them nearly impossible to access. Some documents had been digitized with OCR errors that garbled names. Others existed only on microfiche and county records offices that kept limited hours. It took her nearly a week to compile a comprehensive list, cross-referencing construction permits, union databases and payment records. Eventually she identified 3 names that appeared repeatedly in connection with the deepest construction levels: Howard Trent, electrical systems specialist Miguel Perez, tunnelling engineer Everett Shaw, structural engineer she started with Howard Trent. According to public records, he had worked for an electrical contracting firm based in Denver throughout the 90s. His work on the airport project ended in 1995, coinciding with the airport's opening. His name appeared on dozens of permits and inspection reports for the underground electrical systems. After that, his trail went cold. No tax records after 1998, no death certificate, no forwarding address, no social media presence, though that wasn't unusual for someone his age, but also no obituary, no property records, no vehicle registrations. He simply disappeared from all public databases as if he had never existed beyond 1998. Marin tried to track down family members. She found a sister living in Grand Junction who agreed to a brief phone call. Howard was always paranoid, the sister said. Her name was Ellen, and she sounded tired. After he finished work on the airport, he became convinced someone was watching him, following him. He'd call me at strange hours, saying his phone was tapped, his apartment was bugged. I thought he was having some kind of breakdown. Mental health crisis. Did he say why he thought he was being watched? He said he'd seen things during the construction, things he wasn't supposed to see, rooms that weren't on the official plans, people who didn't belong. He tried to report it to his supervisor but was told to mind his own business. After that, the paranoia got worse. Then one day he just vanished, packed up his apartment in the middle of the night and left. I haven't heard from him since. Did you report him missing? Of course. Police said there was no evidence of foul play. Adults have the right to disappear if they want to. They filed a report, but nothing came of it. Eventually, I just accepted that Howard didn't want to be found. Maybe he finally got away from whatever was scaring him. Or maybe, Marin thought, whatever was scaring him found him first. Miguel Perez's story was different, but equally troubling. He had continued working in construction for several years after the airport opened, primarily on government contracts, mining operations, tunnel boring projects, underground infrastructure. Exactly the kind of specialised work that would make him valuable to certain agencies. In 2003, he died in what was officially ruled a workplace accident. The details were vague. Something about a toolshed collapse at a site in Colorado Springs. Marin requested the accident report through public records requests. It took 3 weeks to arrive, and when it did, the document was heavily redacted. Entire pages were blacked out. The cause of death was listed simply as blunt force trauma. No further details provided. The investigation had been conducted not by local police but by federal workplace safety inspectors. The site where the accident occurred had no other identifying information. Just a permit number that led nowhere. She tried to contact Miguel's family. His widow had remarried and moved to Texas. When Marin called, the woman refused to discuss her first husband's death. I was told not to talk about it, she said. I was told that for my own safety and the safety of my children, I should never discuss what happened to Miguel. That's all I can say. Who told you that? People in suits, federal people. They visited me after the funeral. They said Miguel's death was connected to classified work and discussing it publicly could compromise national security. They didn't threaten me directly, but the implication was clear. So I moved away, I remarried, I started over, and I don't look back. That left Everett Shaw. Finding Shaw took considerable effort. He had moved multiple times since leaving Colorado, each time covering his tracks carefully, but Marin finally located him through a property record in Wyoming, listed as the owner of a small ranch outside the town of Pinedale. She called first, but the number was disconnected. She tried emailing, but the address bounced back. Finally, she decided to drive up and knock on his door. The ranch was isolated, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through pine forests and open meadows for miles. A hand-painted sign near the entrance read "No trespassing, serious." Below it, a second sign, "Property under video surveillance." Marin parked near the gate and walked the remaining quarter mile to the main house, noting the camera mounted on a tree near the entrance. The property was well maintained but austere. A weathered log structure with smoke rising from the chimney, a barn that looked recently painted, a garden plot covered for winter. She was halfway across the yard when a man emerged from the house holding a rifle. "That's far enough," he called out. He didn't point the weapon at her, but he kept it ready. Marin raised her hand slowly. "Mr. Shaw, my name is Marin Cole. I'm an urban planner from Denver. I'd like to talk to you about the airport project." The man was in his 60s, lean and weathered, with grey hair pulled back in a ponytail. His face was deeply lined, carved by weather and worry. He kept the rifle pointed at the ground, but didn't lower it completely. "I haven't worked on that project in 30 years. Got nothing to say about it. Please, just 5 minutes. I drove 4 hours to get here." Something in her voice must have reached him. Shaw studied her for a long moment, his eyes moving from her face to her car to the road beyond, as if checking whether she'd been followed. Finally, he jerked his head toward the house. 5 minutes, then you leave and you don't come back, and you never tell anyone where you found me." Inside, the house was surprisingly comfortable. Books lined the walls, technical manuals mixed with philosophy and history. A wood stove radiated heat. The furniture was simple but well made. On a desk near the window, Marin saw surveillance monitors showing different angles of the property. Shaw poured coffee without asking if she wanted any, then sat across from her at a rough wooden table. The rifle leaned against the wall within easy reach. "Why are you really here?" he asked. Marin pulled out a copy of the blueprint she had received and slid it across the table. "Someone sent me this. I've been researching the airport's construction, trying to verify if it's real. I've talked to other contractors. Most are too scared to say anything, but I think you know the truth." Shaw looked at the blueprint for a long time. His hands trembled slightly. Whether from age or emotion, Marin couldn't tell. "Where did you get this?" "It was sent anonymously. Is it real?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he stood and walked to a closet, rummaging through boxes until he found what he was looking for. He returned with a yellowed folder containing his own set of construction documents, pages covered with his handwritten notes and calculations. "We were divided into specialized teams," he said quietly, spreading the documents across the table. "Different contractors for different sections. No one was supposed to see the complete picture, but I kept copies of everything. Force of habit from 40 years in the business. My father taught me to never trust that someone else had the records you might need someday." He pulled out several documents showing various levels of the underground construction, each more complex than the last. Sublevels 1 through 3 were the baggage system. Everyone knew about those. Sublevel 4 was supposed to be mechanical systems, HVAC, power distribution. Sublevel 5 was utilities and emergency backup power, redundant systems that could keep the airport operational during a crisis. And Sublevel 6? Shaw met her eyes, and she saw something in his gaze that made her understand why he lived out here, alone, watching his perimeter with cameras and keeping a rifle within reach. "We were told to build containment rooms, not storage, not utility spaces, containment. With pressure seals, air filtration systems rated for biological hazards, reinforced observation windows made of material I'd only seen in military applications. The specifications were unlike anything I'd worked on in civilian construction, and I'd been building for 40 years at that point. What were they designed to contain? They never told us. But I can tell you what they built. Holding chambers with walls thick enough to survive a direct missile strike, environmental testing labs with equipment that could monitor conditions down to parts per million, a central vault with security protocols I'd only seen in military installations, multiple redundant power sources, air systems that could maintain positive pressure for months, water filtration that could purify anything. The whole level extended for miles way beyond the airport property boundaries. We tunnelled under federal land BLM territory, areas where no one would notice construction. Why would they build something like that? Shaw leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. I've spent 30 years trying to answer that question. My best guess. It's a research site. Something they needed to keep hidden, secure and accessible only to people with the highest clearances. During the Cold War, the government built facilities like this all over the country. Underground bases, continuity of government sites, research installations studying things the public wasn't supposed to know about. Most people think that ended when the Soviet Union fell, but I think they kept building, and Denver International Airport was the perfect cover. He pulled out another document, this one a rough hand-drawn map. This is my reconstruction of Sub-Level 6's layout based on what I saw, and what I could piece together from talking to other contractors who'd work on adjacent sections. The main access points are here and here. He pointed to locations near Terminals B and C. But there are other entrances, emergency exits, service tunnels, and connections to other facilities miles away. Connected to what? That, I don't know for certain. But I heard rumours during construction. Whispers among contractors who'd had one too many beers after their shifts. Rumours about connections to Cheyenne Mountain, to NORAD, to other facilities that officially have nothing to do with the civilian airport. One electrician told me he'd wired a tunnel that ran due south for 50 miles. Another guy said he'd installed communication equipment that was hardened against electromagnetic pulses. Military-grade stuff. Why would an airport need that? Marin studied the map, committing every detail to memory. Why are you telling me this? Everyone else I've talked to refuses to say anything. Shaw was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the lines on his map. Because I'm old, and I'm tired of carrying this alone. Because Howard is gone and Miguel is dead and I'm probably next. And because someone needs to know the truth before we're all silenced. He looked up at her. Do you know what it's like to live in fear for 30 years? To know that everything you built, every calculation you made, every blueprint you drew was part of something you don't understand, something potentially terrible? Do you think you're in danger? I've been living off-grid for 20 years. I don't use email. I barely use the phone. My property has security that would make a paranoid survivalist proud. I take precautions because yes, I believe talking about this is dangerous. He folded up the maps and handed them to Marin. But I also believe the truth matters more than my safety. So here, take these. Find out what's really down there. Just be careful. People who dig too deep into this tend to have accidents. What kind of accidents? Howard disappeared. Miguel was crushed in a tool shed that somehow collapsed, even though it was new construction that had passed multiple safety inspections. I had a close call myself in 2001. Someone tampered with the brakes on my truck. I survived because I was paranoid enough to check them before driving anywhere important. After that, I moved here. Changed my name on everything except the property deed. Cut ties with everyone from my old life. Do you know who's behind it? Not individuals, but organisations. Federal agencies with budgets so black they don't appear in any public documents. Military contractors who answer to people without names. Intelligence services that operate beyond oversight. The kind of shadow government that conspiracy theorists talk about, except it's real. It's been real since the Cold War and it never went away. It just got better at hiding. Marin took the documents carefully, treating them like the precious evidence they were. Thank you for trusting me with this. Don't thank me yet. This information might just get you killed. Shaw walked to the window looking out at the forest surrounding his property. But if you're going to do this, if you're going to dig all the way down to the truth, then do it right. Document everything. Create redundant copies. Send it to people you trust in different locations. And most importantly, if you find something definitive, something that proves what's down there, don't try to be a hero. Release it all at once. Make it public immediately. That's your only protection. Part 8. The Federal Visit. The men arrived 3 days after Marin returned from Wyoming. She had been working from home, reviewing the documents Shaw had given her and trying to cross-reference them with other construction records when someone knocked on her apartment door at 8 in the evening. Through the peephole she saw 2 men in plain clothes. They looked official in the way federal agents always do. Neat haircuts, conservative suits that managed to be both expensive and deliberately forgettable. Expressionless faces that gave away nothing. She had been expecting this. Shaw had warned her. Thomas Burkhart had warned her. Even Richard Voss in his careful way had warned her. When you start asking questions about Denver International Airport, when you talk to too many people and dig too deep into records that someone wants to stay buried, people notice. Marin considered not answering, but they knocked again, firm and patient, and she knew they would keep knocking until she opened the door. Marin Cole? The first man asked when she cracked open the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. Who's asking? We'd like to talk to you about your recent research activities. He didn't show identification, didn't introduce himself. His partner stood slightly behind him, hands clasped in front, eyes scanning the hallway. I'm not discussing my research with anyone. The second man spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. Miss Cole, we're not here to threaten you. We're here to give you some friendly advice. Stop contacting former airport contractors. Stop requesting restricted construction documents. Move on to other projects. There are plenty of interesting infrastructure stories that don't touch on matters of national security. I haven't done anything illegal. No one's saying you have. But understand that certain projects have ongoing security implications. Interfering with those projects, even inadvertently through historical research, can lead to complications you don't want. Questions from other agencies, difficulties with future employment, problems that would make your life significantly less pleasant. The first man pulled a business card from his pocket and slipped it through the gap in the door. It was blank except for a phone number. If you decide you want to discuss what you found, call this number. Someone will listen. But if you continue down your current path, we can't guarantee your safety. Not because we would harm you, but because you're getting close to things that other people we don't control, might want to remain hidden. Is that supposed to be reassuring? It's supposed to be honest. There are forces at work that are bigger than any individual, bigger than any single agency. Some things are classified for good reasons. Some secrets exist because knowing the truth would cause more harm than maintaining the lie. They turned to leave, but as the second man descended the stairs, something fell from his pocket. A small laminated card which he didn't seem to notice. Marin waited until they were gone, counting to 60, listening for the sound of car doors, an engine starting. Only then did she open her door fully and retrieve the card. It was an access badge for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. She stood in her apartment doorway, holding the badge, trying to understand what it meant. DTRA was a Department of Defense organization focused on countering weapons of mass destruction. Chemical weapons, biological threats, nuclear materials. They worked on preventing the proliferation of WMDs, responding to biothreat scenarios, developing countermeasures against radiological attacks. Why would DTRA care about an airport, unless the airport was involved in exactly those kinds of threats? Unless Sub-Level 6 was a research facility studying the very things DTRA was designed to counter, or perhaps containing them. Part 9. The Cheyenne Mountain Connection. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency badge changed everything. Marin spent the next week researching DTRA operations and historical government programs related to continuity of government and bio-threat response. What she discovered painted a disturbing picture. During the Cold War, the United States had built extensive underground facilities designed to preserve government functions in the event of nuclear war. Some were well known. The bunker beneath the Greenbrier Hotel in West Virginia, where Congress would relocate. Mount Weather in Virginia, the Emergency Operations Center for Executive Branch. Raven Rock in Pennsylvania, the Pentagon's alternate command center. But there were others, classified sites that appeared only as rumours and declassified hints in historical documents. Site R, Site E. The dozens of facilities that fell under the umbrella of continuity of government planning but were never officially acknowledged. The declassified documents she could find revealed a massive infrastructure of underground installations built throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s, designed to preserve American government and military capability in the event of catastrophic attack. And according to reports from various investigative journalists and researchers who had spent years tracking these sites, the construction never stopped. Even after the Cold War ended, even after the Soviet Union fell, the underground facilities continued to expand and upgrade, because the threats didn't end with nuclear war. Biological weapons, genetically engineered pathogens, chemical agents that could devastate populations, these threats were harder to detect, harder to defend against, and potentially more dangerous than nuclear weapons because they could be deployed with far less infrastructure. Marion found references in government documents to strategic biological repositories and continuity of species programs. The language was bureaucratic, deliberately vague, but the implications were clear. The government had been collecting genetic samples, storing biological materials, preparing for scenarios where human DNA itself might need to be preserved. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway was a public example of this thinking. A facility built deep in Arctic permafrost, designed to preserve seeds from every known crop species in case of agricultural collapse. It was openly acknowledged, even celebrated. But what if there were similar facilities for human genetic material? What if someone had decided that preserving the human species required the same kind of ark? And where would you build such a facility in the United States? Somewhere secure, somewhere with extensive underground construction that wouldn't attract attention, somewhere with connections to military command structures like NORAD, somewhere like Denver International Airport. Cheyenne Mountain, home to NORAD, was 75 miles south of Denver. It was one of the most famous military installations in the world, carved deep into granite, designed to withstand a direct nuclear strike. The installation could seal itself off from the outside world, operating independently for months if necessary. But even Cheyenne Mountain needed support infrastructure, supply lines, personnel transit, emergency protocols for moving critical assets quickly from vulnerable locations to protected ones. What if Denver International Airport wasn't just an airport? What if it was part of a larger continuity of government network, a hub in a system of underground facilities designed to preserve not just government functions, but human capability itself? Marin created a map showing all the known underground facilities in Colorado and Wyoming. Then she added the tunnel networks from Shaw's documents, extending them based on the geological surveys and transportation corridors that made sense for underground construction. The pattern was undeniable. They formed a constellation of connected sites with Denver International Airport at the centre. Lines radiated outward, south to Cheyenne Mountain, west toward various military installations in the Rockies, north toward Wyoming facilities, east into the plains where surveillance and early warning systems had been built during the Cold War. She found references in old military reports to strategic relocation routes and emergency population management scenarios. One document, partially declassified in 2007, mentioned genetic preservation protocols and biodiversity contingency planning without providing any specific details about where these programs were implemented. Another document, from a 1980s congressional hearing on civil defense, contained a single telling line: the committee recommends continued funding for underground biological repositories, with primary sites to be established in geologically stable regions with existing federal infrastructure. Geologically stable regions, like the Front Range of Colorado, existing federal infrastructure, like a major airport built on federal land with extensive underground construction. In the event of a catastrophic attack or breakdown of civil order, certain facilities would become operational. People deemed essential to national security would be moved to protected locations. Genetic samples would be secured, research materials would be preserved, and the infrastructure for that movement needed to be built in advance, hidden within civilian projects where it wouldn't attract attention. Denver International Airport, with its massive underground construction, its federal involvement, its connections to military installations, made perfect sense as part of that infrastructure. But that didn't explain the containment rooms, or the observation galleries, or the specific reference to anomalous biological specimens. That suggested something beyond just genetic storage, something beyond just continuity of government. That suggested they were studying something, containing something that required the kind of security protocols normally reserved for the most dangerous materials on Earth. Part 10. The infiltration. Marin knew she needed to get into sub-level 6 herself. The documents and witness testimonies had given her the outline, but she needed proof. Physical evidence. Photographs that couldn't be dismissed as fabrications or misinterpretations. She spent 2 weeks planning her approach. Getting into the secure areas of the airport would require either extensive hacking of security systems, which was beyond her capabilities, or finding someone with access who could help her. The answer came from an unexpected source. One of her college classmates, a woman named Patricia Chen, worked as a facilities manager for the airport authority. They had stayed in touch sporadically over the years, meeting for coffee every few months to catch up on their careers and lives. Patricia had been with the airport for almost a decade, long enough to have access to areas most employees never saw. Marin invited her to lunch at a quiet restaurant in Cherry Creek and carefully broached the subject. "I'm working on a research project about underground construction," she explained, after they had ordered and exchanged the usual pleasantries about work and family. "Particularly the older sections of the airport that aren't in regular use anymore. I was wondering if you could give me a tour of some of those areas for the book I'm writing." Patricia looked uncomfortable. She set down her fork and studied Marin with an expression that was hard to read. "Most of the old tunnel sections are restricted. Even I don't have clearance for everything down there. But you have clearance for some areas." "Some, yes. The decommissioned baggage tunnels, certain mechanical sections, emergency access routes that haven't been used in years. But Marin, there are places down there that nobody talks about. Places that technically don't exist on any current airport maps. If you're asking me to take you to those places, the answer is no. I could lose my job, possibly face criminal charges if I accessed restricted areas without authorization. I'm not asking you to risk your career. Just show me what you're allowed to show me. That's all." Patricia studied her for a long moment. "Why is this important to you? You're not writing a book about infrastructure. You're looking for something specific. What is it?" Marin considered lying, constructing some plausible cover story. But Patricia deserved the truth. They had been friends for over 15 years. Patricia had always been honest with her. So Marin explained everything. The anonymous blueprint, the contractor interviews, the federal visit, the connections she had uncovered between the airport and government programs that officially didn't exist. Everything. When she finished, Patricia was quiet for several minutes, pushing food around her plate without eating. The restaurant buzzed with lunchtime conversation around them, people discussing business deals and vacation plans, normal life carrying on while they talked about conspiracies and underground facilities. "I've worked at that airport for 10 years, Patricia said finally, and there are things I've seen, things I've noticed that never made sense. Security protocols that seem excessive for a civilian facility, sections that require federal clearances to access, deliveries that arrive at odd hours with military escorts, trucks with no markings. I always assumed it was related to post-9/11 security measures, heightened vigilance. But maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's always been more than that. Will you help me? I'll show you what I can access. But we do this my way, during a maintenance shift when fewer people are around. And if we get caught, the story is we were just doing a routine inspection of systems that haven't been checked in a while. Plausible deniability. Understood. Understood." They scheduled the tour for the following Tuesday, during the overnight shift between 2 and 4 in the morning when airport traffic was minimal and most of the facility staff was at reduced capacity. Part 11. Descent into Sub-Level. 6. Patricia picked Marin up at 1:30 in the morning from a parking garage 3 blocks from the airport. They drove separately to a service entrance on the eastern perimeter of the airport property, far from the main terminals and the areas where late-night travellers might see them. This entrance is used mainly for maintenance crews and contractors, Patricia explained as she swiped her access card at a plain metal door marked only with a number. Security is lighter here, but we still need to move carefully. There are cameras in most sections and the security centre monitors everything. Won't they notice us? I filed a maintenance inspection request for tonight. As far as the system knows, we're checking HVAC systems and electrical panels in the lower levels. Normal work. But we'll need to stick to areas where that story makes sense. They entered through the metal door into a concrete corridor lit by industrial lighting. The air was cool and slightly damp, carrying the smell of machine oil and ozone. The floor was painted concrete, marked with yellow safety lines and directional arrows that had faded over time. Patricia led them through a maze of passages, each turn taking them deeper into the facility's infrastructure. They passed through sub-level 1, where the active baggage systems hummed and clicked, automated carts moving luggage between terminals. The sound echoed off concrete walls, creating a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. They descended further into the abandoned sections. Sub-level 3 was where the failed baggage system equipment sat in silent rows, a graveyard of broken conveyor belts and rusting machinery. Everything was covered in dust, untouched for years. The air here was staler, the temperature cooler. "This is normally as far as I go," Patricia said. They stood at a junction where a locked gate barred further progress. A sign read, "Authorised personnel only, federal clearance required." Beyond the gate, the character of the tunnels changed. The lighting was newer, LED instead of the older fluorescent fixtures. The walls were smoother, more finished. This wasn't abandoned infrastructure. This was actively maintained. "Can you open it?" "My card technically has clearance, but there's a log. If anyone checks, they'll see I accessed this area outside of normal maintenance hours. They'll have questions." "I understand if you want to turn back." Patricia hesitated, her hand on the card reader. Marin could see the conflict in her friend's face, weighing curiosity and loyalty against career and safety. Finally, Patricia swiped her card. The lock disengaged with a heavy clunk that echoed through the tunnels. "No going back now," Patricia whispered. Beyond the gate, everything was different. The passages were climate-controlled, the temperature precisely maintained. Digital keypads controlled access to various doors. Security cameras mounted in protective housings tracked their movement, red lights indicating active recording. They descended 2 more levels via a service stairwell that seemed to go down forever. Marin counted the steps. 53, 54, 55. At the bottom, they emerged into a corridor unlike anything in the upper levels. This was sub-level 5. And it was definitely not abandoned. Climate control units hummed in the walls. Digital keypads controlled access to various doors, each requiring card authentication and presumably tracking every entry. The floors were polished concrete, clean and well maintained. The walls were painted institutional white, marked with coloured lines that indicated different zones and purposes. "We shouldn't be here," Patricia whispered, even though they appeared to be alone. "This area is definitely off limits." But Marin had come too far to turn back now. She moved forward, checking doors, searching for any way down to the 6th sub-level. She knew from Shaw's documents that the access point should be near this location, somewhere in this section of sub-level 5. She found it near the end of the corridor, an elevator shaft with buttons labelled 1 through 5 and a blank button at the bottom of the panel. No label, no indication of what the blank button led to. But Marin knew. This was the entrance to sub-level 6. Patricia saw what she was looking at. "That button requires a keycard I don't have. I've seen it before, but never had authorization to use it. I've never been to whatever level that accesses. I don't even know if anyone on my team has." Marin examined the panel. There was no label, no indication of what the blank button led to, but she knew from Shaw's documents that this was it. The final level. The place where the truth was hidden. She pressed the button, not really expecting it to work. But to her surprise, the elevator engaged. The blank button glowed red, and she heard the mechanism activating above them. "How did you do that?" Patricia asked, her voice tight with nervousness. "I don't know. Maybe the security protocols are looser during maintenance hours. Maybe your card has more access than you thought." The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The doors opened to reveal an interior that was immaculately clean, stainless steel walls reflecting the LED lighting. Marin and Patricia exchanged glances. "Last chance to turn back," Marin said. "We're already caught on camera. Might as well see what we came for." They stepped into the elevator. Marin pressed the blank button. The doors closed, and the elevator began to descend. It took a long time, much longer than the descent between normal floors. Marin watched the digital display, but it showed no floor numbers, just a blank screen. They were descending into a part of the facility that officially didn't exist, into sub-level 6. When the doors finally opened, they stepped into a space that took Marin's breath away. This was not a maintenance tunnel. This was not abandoned infrastructure. This was a facility. The corridor stretched ahead of them, pristinely white walls with sealed doors every 30 feet. The air was temperature controlled, filtered, with no hint of the mustiness that pervaded the upper tunnels. Overhead lights were embedded in the ceiling at regular intervals, creating a clinical brightness that reminded Marin of research laboratories or hospital operating theatres. Everything was clean, everything was maintained, everything suggested active use. They walked forward slowly, their footsteps echoing off the walls. Each door they passed had a digital keypad and a small window, but most windows were covered from the inside. The doors were labelled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to Marin. A12, B7, C19. About halfway down the corridor they found a door that was slightly ajar. Room designation. Observation Gallery 3. Marin pushed it open carefully. Inside was a large observation room. One wall was entirely glass, looking into a chamber beyond. The chamber was empty now, but the walls showed signs of heavy use. Scuff marks that looked like something had been thrown against them. Discoloration in places where chemicals or biological materials might have been present. Mounting points on the floor and ceiling where equipment had been installed and removed. The observation room itself contained equipment racks, now mostly empty. Along one wall, metal shelves held dozens of identical sealed containers. Each container was about the size of a shoebox, made of some kind of specialised alloy, with temperature gauges on the sides and biohazard warnings stamped on the tops. Marin examined one of the containers. It was heavy, carefully sealed. The temperature gauge read -20 degrees Celsius. A numeric code was stencilled on its side, but no other identifying information. No labels indicating what was inside. "These are biological storage containers," Patricia said quietly, joining her at the shelves. "We use similar ones in the airport's quarantine facilities for handling potentially contaminated materials. But these are much more sophisticated, military grade, the kind of thing you'd use for long-term storage of hazardous biological materials." They explored 3 more rooms, finding similar setups. Observation areas overlooking empty chambers, storage facilities with specialised equipment, sealed rooms with reinforced walls and sophisticated ventilation systems. Everything spoke of active research, careful containment, protocols designed to handle materials that required the highest levels of security. In the last room they checked, Marin found something that made everything clear. On a door at the far end of the chamber, painted letters were visible beneath layers of grime and half-hearted attempts to cover them with white paint. Someone had tried to erase these words, but they showed through. Anomaly Containment, Section A. The letters had faded, been partially obscured, but they were unmistakable. This wasn't a storage facility. This wasn't a government bunker. This was a containment site for something that required isolation, observation, and federal security. Something anomalous. Patricia was taking photographs with her phone, documenting everything. The empty chambers, the storage containers, the labels on equipment racks, the warning signs, evidence that sub-level 6 was real and active. "We need to go," she said, checking the time on her phone. "We've been down here too long. If security's watching the cameras..." An alarm began to sound. Not loud, but persistent. A red light started flashing above the elevator. They ran. Part 12. The Blue Horse. They made it back to the service entrance without encountering security, but Marin knew their time had run out. By morning, someone would review the access logs and camera footage. Patricia would be questioned about why she had accessed restricted areas during a supposed maintenance inspection. The facility would know they had been there. In the parking garage, Patricia handed Marin a USB drive. "Everything I photographed. All of it. Take it. I'll claim I was doing a routine inspection if anyone asks, but I don't think they'll believe me. I'll probably be fired, maybe prosecuted, but at least we'll have proof. I'm sorry I got you involved in this. Don't be. I've been ignoring my instincts about this place for years. Every time I saw something that didn't make sense, every time I encountered security protocols that seemed excessive for a civilian facility, I told myself it was none of my business, that there were good reasons for everything. But maybe it's time someone actually looked at what's down there." She got into her car, started the engine. "Be careful, Marin. Whatever this is, it's big and dangerous. People don't build facilities like that without being willing to protect them." Marin drove home as dawn broke over Denver. She was exhausted, running on adrenaline and too much coffee, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She thought about everything she had discovered: the containment chambers, the biological storage, the federal security, all hidden beneath an airport that shouldn't have needed any of those things. And she thought about something else, something she had noticed during all her research but hadn't fully connected until now: the Blue Mustang statue. Everyone who visited Denver International Airport knew about the statue. It was impossible to miss. A 32-foot sculpture of a rearing horse, painted bright blue with glowing red eyes. Locals called it Blucifer, a name that captured both the statue's demonic appearance and its dark history. The sculptor, Luis Jimenez, had been killed during its construction when a section of the statue fell on him, severing an artery in his leg. He bled to death in his studio before help could arrive. The statue was unveiled in 2008, 13 years after the airport opened. The official explanation was that it represented the wild spirit of the American West, a symbol of freedom and untamed nature. But the statue had always generated controversy. Parents complained that it gave their children nightmares. Some people claimed to see the red eyes glowing in the dark, visible from the highway miles away. Local legends sprang up about the statue being cursed, about Jimenez's death being a sacrifice, about the horse being a guardian of something beneath the airport. Marin had always dismissed these stories as simply bad art combined with urban legend, but now she pulled up photographs and technical specifications of the statue's construction. The statue weighed 9,000 pounds. Its internal structure was made of steel armatures and support brackets. Complex engineering required to keep the rearing horse balanced on its hind legs. The plans showed a sophisticated system of internal supports, anchoring deep into the ground to prevent the massive sculpture from toppling. And those support brackets, those internal structures, those anchor points that extended deep underground, looked remarkably similar to the containment bracket designs she had seen in the Sub-Level 6 blueprints. The same angles, the same reinforcement patterns, the same engineering principles used for structures that needed to withstand extreme stress. What if the statue wasn't just art? What if it was a marker, a symbol visible from the air indicating the location of the facility below? She spent the morning researching the statue's design process, its funding sources, the decision to place it exactly where it stood. The more she learned, the more deliberate everything seemed. The statue sat on the western edge of the airport property, at the end of the main access road. Directly beneath its location, according to Shaw's maps, was one of the primary access points to Sub-Level 6. It was a sign. A massive, impossible-to-miss sign, telling anyone who knew what to look for exactly where the underground facility could be accessed. The glowing red eyes visible from miles away. A beacon. a navigational aid for aircraft that needed to find this facility quickly, even without radio contact. The blue colour? Blue was the NATO standard for identifying biological hazards. The rearing horse, positioned as if about to strike. A warning, a symbol of power and danger. And Jimenez's death? Marin didn't want to believe it was intentional, but the timing was suspicious. He had completed the statue. He knew how it was built, where the anchor points were located, what lay beneath. Had he asked questions? Noticed things? Discovered the truth about what his statue was really marking? She couldn't prove any of this, but the pattern was there, visible once you knew how to look. Part 13. The Truth Hidden from the Public. With all the pieces assembled, Marin began to see the larger picture. In the documents Patricia had photographed, there were references to something called MK Denver. The name appeared on file labels, on storage containers in the observation rooms, on digital displays that Patricia had captured in her photos. Marin searched for any mention of MK Denver in public records and found nothing, but she did find references to other MK programs from the Cold War era. MK Ultra, the notorious CIA mind control experiments that tested LSD and other drugs on unwitting subjects. MK Search, its successor program, which expanded the research to include hypnosis and behavioral modification. MK Naomi focused on biological weapons and incapacitating agents. The MK designation seemed to be associated with classified research projects that pushed ethical boundaries, programs that operated in the shadows of government oversight, studying things that the public wasn't supposed to know about. MK Denver could be another program in that lineage, but what was its purpose? In one of Patricia's photos, Marin had caught a clear image of a document lying on a desk in one of the observation rooms. She zoomed in, enhancing the image as much as possible using photo editing software. The document header read, MK Denver, Population Continuity Through Genetic Preservation, Phase 2 Implementation. Below that, a list of objectives. Maintain viable genetic samples of strategic personnel. Create controlled environment storage for biological materials. Establish protocols for rapid DNA sequencing and analysis. Develop containment procedures for anomalous biological specimens. Coordinate with DTRA for biothreat response scenarios. This wasn't just a bunker. It wasn't just a storage facility. This was a genetic vault, similar to the seed vaults built to preserve plant species in case of global catastrophe. But instead of seeds, they were preserving human genetic material, DNA of strategic personnel, whatever that meant. Government officials, military leaders, scientists, people deemed essential to rebuilding civilization if catastrophe struck. And there was that word again, anomalous biological specimens. What did that mean? What kind of specimens required containment in a secure underground facility with federal oversight and military-grade security? Marin found another photo that provided a clue. Patricia had photographed a wall chart in one of the labs, a timeline showing different phases of the MK Denver program. Phase 1, 1975 to 1988. Sample collection and storage protocols established Phase 2, 1989 to 2003. Facility construction and anomaly containment procedures. Phase 3, 2004 to present. Unknown, listed only as operational contingency. The timeline suggested that MK Denver had been running for almost 50 years. It had begun during the Cold War, continued after the Soviet Union fell, and was still active now. But what was Phase 3? What operational contingency required a facility this size, this secure, this hidden? Marin spent hours going through every photo Patricia had taken, every document visible in the images, looking for more information. She found references to other programs with cryptic names: Genetic Arc Protocol, Biodiversity Contingency, Species Preservation Initiative. All of them seemed to be connected to MK Denver. All of them suggested preparation for some kind of catastrophic event that would threaten human survival. But none of them explained the containment chambers. None of them explained why observation rooms had been built with reinforced glass capable of withstanding extreme impacts. None of them explained what anomalous biological specimens meant, unless they had found something that didn't fit existing categories, something that required study and containment because it posed a threat that no one had anticipated. Part 14. The tape. Among the items Patricia had photographed was an old VHS tape, sitting on a shelf in one of the observation rooms. The label, barely legible in the photo, read, "Anomaly Behaviour Footage, 98. Marin needed to see what was on that tape. She knew returning to the airport was reckless. Patricia had almost certainly been identified by now, her access privileges revoked, possibly even detained for questioning. Security would be heightened. They would be watching for exactly the kind of intrusion Marin was planning, but that tape might contain the proof she needed. Visual evidence of what Sub-Level 6 was really for. Something that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. She returned alone that night, using the same service entrance Patricia had shown her. The access card Patricia had given her still worked, which surprised her until she realised it might be a trap. They might be letting her in, watching to see what she would do, who she would contact. But she had come this far. She couldn't stop now. Getting into the underground levels was easier than she expected. The route was burned into her memory. Down the stairs, through the checkpoints, into the restricted zone. She moved quickly, confidently, as if she belonged there, as if she had every right to be in these tunnels at 3 a.m. She made it to Sub-Level 6. The elevator descended with that same unsettling smoothness, carrying her down into a place that officially didn't exist. The corridor was as she remembered it. White walls, sealed doors, clinical lighting. But something was different. She could hear something. A low humming sound, like machinery running behind the walls, and voices distant and muffled coming from somewhere deeper in the facility. She found the observation room where the tape had been. It was still there, sitting exactly where Patricia had photographed it, as if waiting for someone to find it. Marin took the tape and retreated back through the tunnels, her heart pounding every time she passed a camera or heard footsteps in distant corridors. She was certain she would be caught, certain that security was watching her on monitors, letting her get deeper into the facility before they moved in. But no one stopped her. She made it back to the surface, back to her car, back onto the highway, before she allowed herself to breathe normally. Again. Back in her apartment, she set up an old VCR she had kept from college and inserted the tape. Her hands were shaking as she pressed play. The footage that played was unlike anything she had expected. It showed one of the containment chambers from Sub-Level 6, clearly the same room she had seen in person. The timestamp in the corner read August 14th, 1998, 0300 hours. A figure stood in the centre of the chamber. At first it looked human, roughly human-shaped, wearing what appeared to be a hospital gown. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But as the camera zoomed in, details became clear that didn't make sense. The figure's proportions were wrong. Arms slightly too long, reaching below where the knees should be. Legs bent at angles that suggested additional joints. The head tilted at an angle that should have been impossible without breaking the neck, turned almost backward while the body faced forward. And the way it moved. It didn't walk. It jerked between positions without seeming to transition, as if skipping frames in reality itself. One moment standing still, the next moment across the room, with no visible movement between the 2 positions. Behind the observation glass, several people in full biohazard suits watched, taking notes on clipboards. Their voices came through on the audio, clinical and detached, discussing the subject as if it were a laboratory specimen rather than anything that had once been human. Subject remains non-responsive to verbal commands. Cellular degradation continues at the accelerated rate. Current estimate is 72 hours until complete breakdown. Recommendation: transfer to Cheyenne Mountain Facility for further study under Level 4 containment protocols. The figure in the chamber suddenly moved directly toward the camera, impossibly fast. Its face filled the screen for a moment, features distorted and wrong, eyes that were too large and the wrong colour, mouth opening wider than any human jaw could stretch, before the video cut to black. When the image returned, the chamber was empty. The observers were gone. A single voice spoke, barely above a whisper, speaking quickly as if afraid of being overheard. Transfer to Cheyenne Mountain failed. Containment breach during transport. 2 personnel lost. Subject remains active. Keep it here. Maintain sub-level 6 operational status until Phase 3 protocols are implemented. No further attempts to move specimens until new containment procedures are established. The tape ended with one final shot. A blueprint of the entire Denver International Airport with sub-level 6 highlighted in red. In the corner, a handwritten note in the same red ink as the original anonymous blueprint. Sub-level 6 must remain operational until Phase 3. Marin sat in her dark apartment, staring at the static on the television screen. Her mind struggled to process what she had just seen. That figure in the chamber, that thing that looked almost human but wasn't. What was it? Where had it come from? The clinical tone of the observers suggested this wasn't the first time they had dealt with something like this. They had protocols, procedures, language that indicated familiarity with whatever that thing was. Anomalous biological specimen. Not human, not animal, something else. Something that required containment in a facility built to withstand catastrophic containment failures. Something that had killed 2 people during a failed transfer attempt, and they were keeping it at Denver International Airport in sub-level 6 because Cheyenne Mountain had refused to accept it after the transport failure. She now understood what Denver International Airport really was. Not just a transportation hub, not just a government bunker or a genetic vault. It was a containment site, built to isolate and study things that couldn't be explained, things that existed at the edge of scientific understanding. Anomalies. Whether they were products of secret experiments, recovered from unknown sources, or something else entirely she couldn't say. But they were there. Beneath the terminals and runways, beneath the tunnels tourists saw deep in sub-level 6, contained and hidden and watched by federal agencies that officially didn't exist. And Phase 3, whatever that meant, was still coming. Epilogue, the knock at the door. Marin spent the next 2 days organising all her evidence. Photographs, documents, witness testimonies, the tape. She created redundant copies, stored on multiple drives, sent to different locations. She followed Shaw's advice exactly. Document everything. Create backups. Prepare to release it all at once if necessary. She began writing a comprehensive report, detailing everything she'd discovered. She planned to send it to journalists, researchers, advocacy groups, anyone who might be able to corroborate her findings and help make them public. But as she sat at her laptop in a cheap motel room in Colorado Springs, having fled her apartment when she became convinced it was under surveillance, playing the footage one more time to ensure she had captured all the details, someone knocked on her door. 3 precise knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. The pattern was too deliberate to be random, too controlled to be housekeeping or another guest. Marin felt her pulse spike, adrenaline flooding her system. She closed her laptop, walked slowly to the door, and looked through the peephole. 2 men in plain clothes stood in the hallway. Not the same men who had visited her apartment, but the same type. Federal agents or contractors who worked for agencies without names. One of them was holding up a badge she couldn't quite read. They knocked again. The same pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. Marin didn't open the door. Instead, she returned to her laptop and sent one final email to a list of addresses she had carefully curated. Journalists she trusted, activist organisations focused on government transparency, researchers who had studied classified programs, even a few members of Congress who had shown interest in oversight of intelligence agencies. The email contained everything. All the documents, all the evidence, all the witness statements, the photos from sub-level 6, the contractor testimonies, Shaw's maps, Richard Voss's explanations of the runway patterns, the connections to DTRA and continuity of government programs, and the video from the tape. The email's subject line was simple: Denver International Airport what they built beneath. She pressed send just as the knocking stopped. In the silence that followed, she heard other sounds. Footsteps in the hallway, multiple people, a radio crackling, someone speaking in low tones, the metallic sound of equipment being prepared. They weren't leaving, they were preparing to come in. Marin watched her laptop screen, watching the email progress bar inch forward. 50%, 60%. The files were large, the video file especially. It was taking too long. Outside her motel room, she heard a key card being used in the lock. Not her card. A master key, the kind that maintenance or security would have, or that federal agents would obtain. 70%. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, as if whoever was outside wanted to give her time to realise what was happening, time to understand that there was nowhere to go. 80%. The door opened. 3 men entered, moving with professional efficiency. 2 positioned themselves between Marin and the window. The third approached her calmly, hands visible, showing he wasn't armed. "Miss Cole, we need you to step away from the computer." 90%. "Please don't make this difficult. There are things you don't understand. Information that's classified for reasons beyond your clearance. We need to talk about what you think you've discovered." 95%. Marin looked at the screen, then at the men surrounding her. She thought about Howard Trent, who had disappeared, about Miguel Perez, who had died in a suspicious accident, about Everett Shaw, living in isolation because he knew the truth, about her father, who had taught her that buildings don't lie, and paper trails always tell the truth. 100%. Send complete. The man reached for the laptop. Marin closed it gently, meeting his eyes. "It's already out there," she said. "Everything. All of it. Sent to 50 different addresses. By tomorrow, people will be asking questions. And this time, you won't be able to make the questions go away." The man's expression didn't change. "You have no idea what you've done. No idea what you might have compromised. There are reasons, good reasons, why certain things remain classified. Reasons that have nothing to do with covering up wrongdoing and everything to do with public safety. Then let the public decide. If Sublevel 6 is really necessary, if whatever's down there really needs to be kept secret, then make the case. Openly, transparently, but you can't make that choice for everyone." "Sometimes," the man said quietly, "that's exactly what we have to do." He took the laptop. The other 2 men began searching the room, gathering her notes, her phone, anything that might contain additional evidence. "You'll need to come with us," the man said. "We have questions, many questions, about how you accessed restricted areas, who helped you, what else you might have shared. Am I under arrest? That depends on how cooperative you are." Marin stood, knowing she had no choice, but she also knew that the truth was out there now, distributed across the internet in the hands of people who would know what to do with it. The story of Denver International Airport Sublevel 6 wasn't ending with her detention. It was only beginning. Part 15. 3 weeks later. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. A major investigative news outlet published Marin's email in its entirety, along with extensive verification work. They had tracked down Everett Shaw, convinced him to go on record with his knowledge of the underground construction. They had interviewed former contractors, analysed the blueprints, and sent investigators to the airport to document the visible elements of Marin's claims. Most importantly, they had shown the video from the tape to experts in various fields. Forensic video analysts confirmed it hadn't been manipulated or fabricated. Biologists couldn't explain what they were seeing. Physics professors suggested the movement patterns violated known laws of motion. The story spread rapidly. Within hours, it was trending on every social media platform. Other news organisations picked it up. Congressional representatives started asking questions. Aviation authorities were forced to respond. Denver International Airport issued a statement denying everything. No Sublevel 6 existed, they claimed. The blueprint was a fabrication. The video was a hoax. Miss Cole had illegally accessed restricted areas and created an elaborate conspiracy theory. But then an anonymous source within the airport authority confirmed that Patricia Chen had been detained and questioned. for 3 days before being released without charges, that her access privileges had been revoked, that she had been forced to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of prosecution. More whistleblowers came forward. A security guard who had seen strange deliveries to restricted sections. A contractor who had worked on ventilation systems that served areas not on any official maps. An airport employee who had heard rumours about federal agents operating in the underground levels. The Department of Defense initially refused to comment, then issued a blanket denial. Then, when pressed by congressional committees with actual oversight authority, admitted that certain facilities beneath Denver International Airport serve classified national security purposes that cannot be disclosed publicly, which was as good as a confirmation. 3 weeks after Marin sent that email, she was released from federal custody. No charges were filed, though she was warned that further attempts to access classified information would result in prosecution. Her professional license was suspended pending review. Her apartment had been searched, her computers seized, but she was free, and the truth was out. Public tours of Denver International Airport's underground sections were suspended indefinitely. The airport authority announced a comprehensive review of all underground facilities. Congressional hearings were scheduled to investigate what exactly the federal government had built beneath a civilian airport and why. Shaw called her from a burner phone, his voice shaking. "I never thought I'd see this day. Never thought anyone would actually get the truth out there. How are you holding up?" "I've been better, but it was worth it. Be careful, this isn't over. The people who built Sub-Level 6, who've been running whatever programs are down there, they're not going to give up just because some journalists asked questions. They'll regroup, relocate, cover their tracks, but at least now people know. At least now they'll be watching." Patricia reached out through a lawyer, unable to contact Marin directly due to the NDA she had signed. The message was simple. Thank you. Worth it. As for Marin, she spent her days following the unfolding story, watching as investigators dug deeper into the history of Denver International Airport as more information emerged about continuity of government programs and classified research facilities. She didn't know what was really in Sub-Level 6, didn't know what that figure on the tape was or where it had come from, didn't know if MK Denver was still operational or if the facility had been emptied in response to her revelations. But she knew this. For 30 years, something had been hidden beneath Denver International Airport. Something important enough to require massive underground construction, federal security, and decades of secrecy. And now, finally, people were asking the right questions. Whatever Phase 3 was, whatever the planners of Denver International Airport had intended, it would now happen under public scrutiny rather than in complete darkness. Buildings don't lie, her father had taught her. Paper trails always tell the truth, and in the end, the truth had been worth everything it cost. The story of Denver International Airport wasn't ending. It was only beginning. Epilogue 2. The response. 6 months after the story broke, Denver International Airport remained at the centre of a national controversy. Congressional hearings had revealed bits and pieces of the truth. Yes, Sub-Level 6 existed. Yes, it had been built as part of a classified continuity of government program. Yes, it served purposes beyond civilian aviation. But the full truth remained classified. The Department of Defense invoked national security concerns, refusing to disclose the specific nature of the research conducted there or what was currently stored in the facility. The video of the anomalous figure was analysed by every major intelligence agency and dismissed as either a fabrication or, in the carefully worded statement from one official, visual documentation of classified research that cannot be publicly discussed. Which raised more questions than it answered. If the video was real, what was it showing? If it was a fabrication, why would someone go to such lengths to create it? Marin wrote a book about her investigation. It became a bestseller, part memoir, part exposé. She spoke at universities, appeared on podcasts, became an advocate for government transparency and oversight of classified programs. She never got her professional license back. The Urban Planning Board ruled that her actions had violated ethical standards, regardless of the public interest her investigation served. But she found other work, consulting for oversight committees, helping journalists investigate other classified facilities, teaching courses on government secrecy and the public's right to know. Shaw died 8 months after the story broke. Natural causes, according to the death certificate. Heart attack. He was found in his Wyoming ranch, his security system mysteriously disabled. Marin didn't believe it was natural, but she couldn't prove otherwise. Patricia never spoke publicly about what she had seen. The NDA she signed was ironclad, but she sent Marin a card every year on the anniversary of their descent into sub-level 6. No words, just a single image, a photograph of the blue Mustang statue, its red eyes glowing in the night. And Denver International Airport continued to operate. Millions of travellers passed through its terminals every year, rolling their luggage across the Masonic dedication stone, walking past the controversial murals, landing on runways arranged in that suspicious pattern. Most of them never wondered what lay beneath their feet, never questioned why the airport was built so far from the city, why the construction went so far over budget, why security seemed excessive for a civilian facility. But some did. And those questions led to more investigations, more revelations, more truth emerging from the shadows. The full story of Sub-Level 6 might never be told. Some secrets are buried too deep, protected too well, deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. But at least now people knew to ask. At least now the facility beneath Denver International Airport operated with the knowledge that someone was watching. Someone was asking questions. Someone had pulled back the curtain, even if just for a moment, and seen what lay beneath. And that, Marin thought, was enough. For now. Imagine discovering that your government has been lying to you about the greatest threat humanity has ever faced. Imagine learning that while officials tell you everything is normal, they've been secretly building underground cities for themselves and their families. Imagine realising that 300 million Americans have been marked as acceptable losses in a disaster that's not a matter of if, but when. This is a story based on real geological science, actual government protocols, and the terrifying possibility that the truth about Yellowstone is being hidden from you right now. What happens when the greatest natural disaster in human history has been predicted, planned for, and hidden from the public? When a junior geologist stumbles upon evidence that the Yellowstone supervolcano isn't dormant, it's being managed. He discovers that some truths are worth killing for. Special thanks to Nicola for this incredible story concept and detailed research that made this narrative possible. Yellowstone National Park Monitoring Station, October the 15th, 2014. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Eli Grant barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the seismic readout scrolling across his monitor, watching patterns that shouldn't exist dance across the screen like digital ghosts. At 24, fresh out of graduate school with a geology degree from Colorado State, Eli had spent the last 3 months as a USGS intern learning that monitoring America's most dangerous supervolcano was mostly routine data collection, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. This was one of those moments. The microquakes were coming from depths that made his stomach turn. 15 miles down, deeper than any recorded activity in Yellowstone's 30-year digital monitoring history. The frequency was wrong too, clustered in tight bursts rather than the random scatter typical of normal geothermal activity. Each tremor registered between 1.2 and 1.8 on the Richter scale, small enough to be dismissed individually, but together they painted a picture that made Eli's hand shake as he reached for his phone. Before he could dial his supervisor, the screen flickered. The anomalous readings vanished, replaced by a steady green line indicating normal background activity. A automated message popped up. Calibration complete. Data archived. Eli stared at the empty screen. 15 minutes of unprecedented deep seismic activity had just been erased as if it never existed. He quickly navigated to the backup servers, his fingers flying across the keyboard with increasing desperation. The raw data files were gone. The automated alerts had been cleared. Even the emergency notification logs showed nothing but routine system maintenance. "Working late again, kid?" Eli spun around to find Karen Holt standing in the doorway, her park ranger uniform still crisp despite the late hour. At 52, Karen had been patrolling Yellowstone's backcountry for over 2 decades, and her weathered face carried the kind of knowledge that came from watching the park's moods change with the seasons. "Karen, did you feel anything about an hour ago? Any tremors?" She studied his face carefully before stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "You saw something on the monitors?" "Deep quakes, deeper than anything in the database, but they're gone now, scrubbed clean like they never happened." Karen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the sanitized readouts. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Eli had never heard before. "How long have you been working here, Eli?" 3 months. "Long enough to know what you're looking at, not long enough to know what you're not supposed to see." She pulled up a chair beside him. "Let me ask you something. You know why they put the monitoring station here instead of closer to the caldera?" Eli shrugged. "Better communication links, I assumed. Easier access for maintenance." "That's what they tell the interns." Karen's fingers drummed against the desk. "The real reason is that certain types of data collection work better from a distance. Gives you time to curate what goes into the public record." The implication hit Eli like a physical blow. "Are you saying they're hiding seismic data?" "I'm saying that 23 years of watching this place has taught me that Yellowstone keeps secrets, and some people are very invested in keeping those secrets buried." She stood up, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "Don't start asking questions you're not ready to answer, Eli. This park isn't just about geysers." After she left, Eli sat alone in the monitoring station, staring at the clean, normal readouts. But Karen's warning had sparked something dangerous. Curiosity. He pulled up the archived database and began searching for gaps, periods where data might have been scrubbed before. What he found made his pulse quicken. Small deletions in 2009, 2004, and 1997. Always deep seismic activity. Always erased within hours of being recorded. Always during periods when public attention was focused elsewhere. Economic crashes, natural disasters, political scandals. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Eli spent the rest of the night copying every piece of raw data he could access onto external drives, working with the methodical precision of someone who understood that some opportunities only came once. By dawn, he had assembled a fragmentary picture of Yellowstone's hidden activity dating back 15 years. The supervolcano wasn't dormant. It was being watched, monitored, and most importantly hidden from public view. As the sun rose over the Yellowstone River, Eli Grant became the first person outside the conspiracy to see the full scope of what was coming. What he didn't know was that his discovery had already been noted by systems designed to catch exactly this kind of unauthorized access. In a secure facility 300 miles away, automated alerts were already being generated, and decisions were being made about what to do with a curious young geologist who had seen too much. Chapter 1. The Official Story. Yellowstone National Park Headquarters, March 22nd, 2015. The press briefing room was packed with reporters from every major network, their cameras trained on the panel of scientists seated behind a table adorned with official USGS and National Park Service seals. Outside, early spring snow dusted the peaks surrounding Mammoth Hot Springs, but inside the room, the atmosphere was warm with the heat of television lights and simmering questions about Yellowstone's recent activity. Eli stood at the back of the room, his USGS badge giving him access to the media event despite his junior status. In the 5 months since he'd first witnessed the data scrubbing, he'd kept his head down and his mouth shut, but he'd also kept watching. The patterns were becoming clearer and more disturbing with each passing week. Chief Park Scientist Janet Morrison stepped up to the microphone, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense expression. "Good morning. I want to address the speculation that's been circulating online regarding recent seismic activity in Yellowstone National Park." Eli noticed how she avoided mentioning the source of that speculation, a viral video showing hundreds of elk and bison streaming out of the Lamar Valley in what appeared to be a coordinated exodus. The footage had been taken by a tourist 3 weeks earlier and had garnered over 2 million views before park officials managed to provide alternative explanations. "Based on our continuous monitoring of the Yellowstone volcanic system," Morrison continued, "I can state categorically that no eruption is imminent. The seismic activity recorded over the past month falls well within normal parameters for this geologically active region." A reporter from CNN raised her hand. "But what about the animal migrations? Local ranchers are reporting unusual behaviour in wildlife populations. Seasonal migration patterns can vary significantly based on weather conditions, food availability, and natural population cycles," Morrison replied smoothly. "What some observers have interpreted as unusual behaviour is actually quite normal for this time of year." Eli bit back the urge to laugh. He'd seen the internal memos describing the animal movements as unprecedented and potentially indicative of subsurface environmental changes. The scientists on this panel knew exactly what was causing the animals to flee, but they were standing in front of cameras and lying about it with practiced ease. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, each one deflected with rehearsed responses that provided just enough technical detail to sound authoritative while revealing absolutely nothing of substance. As the briefing ended and reporters filed out, Eli lingered near the back of the room, watching the scientists pack up their materials. Impressive performance. Eli turned to find a man in his 40s wearing a FEMA windbreaker, his identification badge hanging from a lanyard around his neck. Deputy Director Marcus Webb, according to the credential. "I'm sorry?" "The briefing. Very professional. Of course, the real challenge isn't managing the press, it's managing the logistics." Webb's smile was friendly, but his eyes remained cold. "You're Eli Grant, aren't you?" "The intern who's been asking interesting questions." Eli's mouth went dry. "I don't know what you mean." "Database queries at odd hours, unusual download activity, IT security flags that kind of behaviour automatically." Webb stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Don't worry. Curiosity is natural in your line of work, but there are some areas where curiosity can become problematic." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm offering advice. FEMA has been conducting training exercises in this region for several months now. Interagency coordination, emergency response protocols, that sort of thing. You might have noticed our vehicles around the park." Eli had noticed. Black SUVs and unmarked trucks had been appearing at various locations throughout Yellowstone, always accompanied by personnel who claimed to be conducting routine training exercises. The timing seemed suspicious. Why increase emergency preparedness training just as seismic activity was being actively suppressed from public records? "What kind of training?" Webb's smile widened. "Zone 5 evacuation protocols. Very comprehensive. Very necessary." He handed Eli a business card. "If you ever want to know more about emergency preparedness, give me a call. But remember, some knowledge comes with responsibilities." After Webb walked away, Eli stood alone in the empty briefing room, turning the card over in his hands. Zone 5 Evacuation Protocols. He'd never heard the term before, despite his security clearance and access to most FEMA documentation. That night, he spent hours searching through official databases, finding references to Zones 1 through 4, but nothing about Zone 5. Whatever Webb was talking about, it existed outside the normal chain of command and public accountability. The realization sent a chill down Eli's spine that had nothing to do with the late spring snow falling outside his apartment window. 3 days later, Karen Holt found him in the monitoring station, hunched over his computer with the intensity of someone racing against time. "You're digging deeper," she observed, not bothering to make it a question. "Someone has to." "They're lying to everyone, Karen. The seismic data, the animal behaviour, the FEMA exercises, none of it adds up to the story they're telling the public." Karen closed the door and activated the white noise generator that was supposedly used to prevent electronic eavesdropping during sensitive conferences. "What do you know about the Deep Bore project?" "Never heard of it." "Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was a joint USGS military operation that ran from 2008 to 2012. The cover story was installation of advanced seismic monitoring equipment in previously inaccessible areas of the park. And the real story? Pressure venting? They were drilling down to the magma chamber and installing systems designed to release pressure in controlled amounts, potentially delaying or preventing a catastrophic eruption. Eli stared at her. That's actually brilliant. Why would they hide something like that?" "Because it didn't work. The magma chamber is too large, too unstable. The venting systems were supposed to buy us decades. Instead, they may have accelerated the timeline." Karen's face was grim. One of the contractors died during the installation phase. Officially, it was an industrial accident. Unofficially, he was murdered to prevent him from talking about what he'd discovered down there. What did he discover? That the eruption isn't a matter of if, Eli. It's a matter of when. And when is a lot sooner than anyone is willing to admit publicly. As Karen left him alone with this revelation, Eli found himself staring at the sanitized seismic readouts with new understanding. The data scrubbing wasn't just about hiding Yellowstone's activity from the public. It was about hiding the failure of a desperate attempt to prevent the greatest natural disaster in human history. And somewhere, people with access to the real data were making plans that didn't include the 300 million Americans living in the path of destruction. Chapter 2. The Elite Plan. USGS Regional Office, Denver, September 14, 2016. The security badge scanner beeped as Eli swiped his credential, granting him access to the restricted archives beneath the Denver Federal Building. 18 months had passed since his first glimpse of the conspiracy, and his official duties had gradually shifted from basic monitoring to special projects, a euphemism for working on data sets that required higher security clearances and absolute discretion. What his supervisors didn't know was that Eli had been using his expanded access to piece together a puzzle that grew more terrifying with each new fragment of information he uncovered. The file he'd been looking for was buried in a section marked HLT 2030, nestled between routine geological surveys and budget projections for monitoring equipment. Hazard Level Threshold 2030. The designation meant nothing to most people, but Eli had learned to recognize the bureaucratic camouflage used to hide the most sensitive documents. He opened the file with trembling fingers. The first page was a summary that made his vision blur. Probabilistic eruption window, 2028 to 2032. Confidence interval, 94.7%. Recommended public disclosure timeline, none. Eli had to read the last line 3 times before its meaning sank in. They had narrowed down the eruption timeline to a 4-year window with near certainty, and the official recommendation was to tell the public nothing. The next section detailed evacuation protocols that divided the American population into 2 distinct categories. Tier 1 included federal government personnel, military leadership, critical infrastructure managers, and selected scientific and medical professionals approximately 2.3 million people who would receive advance warning and priority evacuation to designated safe zones. Tier 2 encompassed everyone else, 327 million Americans whose evacuation status was listed with brutal honesty as no viable plan. Eli scrolled through page after page of logistical nightmares and resource calculations. The ash fallout zone would render most of the continental United States uninhabitable for years. The immediate kill zone, a radius of approximately 700 miles from the eruption site, would experience pyroclastic flows, toxic gas emissions, and complete ecological collapse. Even with advance warning, there weren't enough resources to evacuate more than a fraction of the affected population. But the most damning section came toward the end. Cross-reference construction projects that had been authorized and funded over the past decade. Underground facilities in Colorado, Utah, and South Dakota, officially described as continuity of government installations or strategic resource storage sites. The locations formed a clear pattern, far enough from Yellowstone to avoid the immediate devastation, supplied with independent power and air filtration systems, and sized to accommodate the Tier 1 population for extended periods. None of the facilities were located in Wyoming or Montana, the states that would bear the brunt of the initial eruption. The people living in those areas, including Eli himself, were considered acceptable losses. A sound in the corridor outside made Eli freeze. Footsteps were approaching the archive room, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. He quickly photographed the most critical pages with his phone, replaced the file, and pretended to be reviewing mundane seismic reports. The door opened to reveal Deputy Director Webb and a woman Eli didn't recognize, both wearing the kind of serious expressions that accompanied discussions of national security. "Grant," Webb nodded, "working late again, I see." "Just catching up on some routine analysis," Eli replied, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. The woman studied him with interest. "You're the intern who's been flagged for unusual database access patterns. I prefer to think of myself as thorough." Webb laughed, but the sound held no humour. "Thoroughness is admirable. Discretion is essential. I trust you understand the distinction." After they left, Eli sat alone in the archive room, staring at the photos on his phone. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. A small group of government officials and scientists had known for years that Yellowstone was approaching a catastrophic eruption, and their response had been to save themselves while leaving everyone else to die. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Hundreds of millions of people were going about their daily lives, making plans for the future, raising children and building careers, completely unaware that their government had already written them off as collateral damage in a disaster that could be predicted but not prevented. That night, Eli returned to his apartment in Gardner, Montana, with the decision crystallizing in his mind. The evidence he'd gathered was enough to expose the conspiracy, but he needed more. Documentation that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. He also needed a way to get the information to journalists who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. What he didn't know was that his activities in the archive had been monitored in real time, and that his phone's camera had triggered security algorithms designed to detect unauthorized photography of classified documents. By the time he fell asleep that night, plans were already being made to ensure that Eli Grant's investigation would end before it could threaten the carefully constructed wall of silence surrounding Yellowstone's deadly secret. Chapter 3. The Suppression. Gardner, Montana, November the 8th, 2016. Eli's apartment had been turned upside down with surgical precision. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out and dumped, every electronic device missing or destroyed. But the most telling detail was what the intruders hadn't done. They'd left his television, his expensive hiking equipment, and the cash he kept in a kitchen drawer. This wasn't a random burglary. Someone had been looking for specific items and they'd found them. His laptop was gone. His external hard drives were missing. Even his backup thumb drives, hidden in a hollowed-out book, had been discovered and taken. Months of carefully gathered evidence had vanished in a single night, leaving behind only the photos on his phone. photos he'd been smart enough to upload to a secure cloud storage account before going to bed. Eli stood in his wrecked living room, surveying the damage with a mixture of fear and determination. They'd sent a message: stop digging or face consequences. But they'd also confirmed that his investigation was getting close to something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. His phone buzzed with a text from Karen: "Meet me at Mammoth Terraces, North Side, come alone." 30 minutes later, Eli found Karen standing on the limestone terraces that gave Mammoth Hot Springs its name, her park ranger uniform stark against the white mineral deposits. Steam rose from the thermal features around them, creating an otherworldly landscape that felt appropriate for the conversation they were about to have. "They hit your place," she said without preamble. "How did you know?" "Because they're watching all of us now. Anyone who's asked too many questions, anyone who's shown too much interest in the wrong data." Karen gestured toward the thermal features. "You see these springs? They've been active for thousands of years, but their flow patterns have changed dramatically in the past 18 months. The thermal system is destabilizing. Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know what you've stumbled into." Karen's expression was grim. "I told you I worked on the deep bore project. What I didn't tell you is why I really left." She led him away from the main viewing area, down a maintenance trail that wound behind the limestone formations. The drilling operation was based out of a temporary facility near the Norris Geyser Basin. Officially, we were installing seismic monitoring equipment at depth that would provide better data about magma chamber activity. But that wasn't the real purpose. The real purpose was to tap into the magma chamber and create controlled release valves. The theory was sound. If you could bleed off pressure gradually, you might prevent a catastrophic eruption, or at least delay it long enough to develop better evacuation procedures. They emerged onto a small plateau that offered a clear view of the valley below. In the distance, Eli could see the geometric lines of roads and buildings that marked human presence in the wilderness, tiny and fragile against the vast landscape. What went wrong? Everything. The magma chamber is far more complex than the models predicted. Instead of bleeding off pressure, the venting systems created new pathways for thermal activity. The timeline for eruption may have been accelerated rather than delayed. Karen pulled a small device from her pocket, an encrypted satellite phone that Eli recognized as military hardware. Tom Rodriguez was the lead contractor on the drilling team. Geothermal engineer, 23 years of experience, 3 kids. He started asking questions about why the pressure readings weren't matching the theoretical models. What happened to him? Vehicle accident on a mountain road. Lost control on a curve, went over a cliff. Very tragic. Very convenient. Karen's jaw tightened. Except Tom was one of the most careful drivers I'd ever met, and he'd driven that road hundreds of times. Also, his personal notes about the pressure anomalies disappeared from his trailer the same night he died. The implication was clear and terrifying. Eli was looking at a conspiracy that had already committed murder to protect its secrets. His ransacked apartment wasn't just a warning, it was a preview of what could happen if he continued to threaten their operational security. "Why haven't you gone public with this?" "With what?" "A story about a secret government project with no documentation, a convenient accident with no witnesses, and seismic data that gets scrubbed from official records." Karen shook her head. "They've been very careful to keep everything compartmentalized. Most of the people involved only know pieces of the puzzle. But together we know enough to expose them. Together we know enough to get killed." Karen handed him the satellite phone. "This is encrypted and routes through military satellites. They can't monitor it easily. If something happens to me, use it to contact investigative journalists. The access codes are programmed in." As they walked back toward the main trail, Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was now part of a resistance movement he'd never asked to join, fighting against a conspiracy that had resources and ruthlessness he could barely comprehend. That night, he uploaded everything he'd learned to multiple secure cloud accounts, created encrypted copies of all his evidence, and began drafting detailed summaries that could be understood by journalists without scientific backgrounds. If something happened to him, the truth would still survive. What he didn't know was that Karen Holt had already been marked for elimination, and that his own name had moved to the top of a very short list of people who knew too much to be allowed to live. The conspiracy had spent years perfecting the art of making problematic people disappear without raising suspicions. Eli Grant was about to discover just how efficient they'd become. Chapter 4: The False Flag. Lamar Valley, Yellowstone National Park, June 15th, 2017. The video went viral within hours of being uploaded. Shot on a tourist's smartphone from the Lamar Valley overlook, it showed something that no park official could easily explain away. Nearly 1,000 bison streaming eastward in a coordinated exodus that looked more like a military retreat than seasonal migration. Eli watched the footage for the 12th time, pausing on frames that showed the animals' behaviour. Their ears were pinned back, their movements urgent and purposeful. These weren't animals wandering to new grazing areas. They were fleeing something that had triggered every survival instinct evolution had given them. The official response came within 6 hours. Park spokeswoman Janet Morrison appeared on CNN to explain that large herbivore migrations were completely normal, and that social media was creating panic over natural phenomena that occur regularly in Yellowstone. What Morrison didn't mention was that the bison were fleeing from a section of the park that had been closed to public access for the past 3 months. The Norrisback Basin, officially under restoration after minor geothermal changes, was actually experiencing subsurface temperatures that had increased by nearly 40 degrees Celsius in the past year. Eli had seen the classified reports. New fumaroles were opening weekly. The ground temperature was rising so rapidly that park maintenance crews couldn't approach the monitoring equipment without protective suits. Most telling of all, the area was showing magnetic anomalies consistent with massive metallic intrusions, exactly what you'd expect if the magma chamber was rising toward the surface. His phone buzzed with a message from Karen. "Need to show you something. Tonight. Usual place." They met after midnight at the Mammoth Terraces, their breath visible in the cold mountain air. Karen looked haggard, her face showing the strain of months spent living with dangerous knowledge. "I've been monitoring radio traffic from the restricted zones," she said without preamble. "FEMA has been conducting something called Operation Continuity. Not training exercises, actual deployment." "Deployment of what?" "Command and control infrastructure. They've been installing communication arrays, power systems, and what sounds like permanent housing facilities." Karen pulled out a topographic map marked with red circles. "All of these locations correspond to abandoned Cold War bunkers or natural cave systems. They're building something underground." Eli studied the map. The marked locations formed a rough circle around the Yellowstone caldera, each one positioned outside the immediate blast zone but close enough to maintain operational oversight of the area. How many people could these facilities support? Based on the supply manifests I've been able to intercept, maybe 2,000 people per facility. Enough for essential government personnel and their families, plus a skeleton crew to maintain basic infrastructure. The scope of the deception was staggering. While telling the public that Yellowstone posed no immediate threat, the government was quietly building underground cities designed to preserve a small fraction of the population through the greatest natural disaster in human history. "I want to see one of these facilities." Karen shook her head. "Too dangerous. They've got military-grade security at all the sites now." "Then how do we prove any of this exists?" "We don't. Not directly." Karen handed him a small device that looked like a modified GPS unit. "But we can document the construction activity. This is a ground-penetrating radar unit, modified to detect large underground structures. If we can map the facilities from the surface, we can prove they exist without having to penetrate their security." 2 nights later, they drove to a remote area near the Shoshone National Forest, following Forest Service roads that weren't marked on any public maps. The official designation was a wildlife research station, but the facilities visible from the access road looked more like a military installation than a scientific outpost. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire surrounded the compound. Guard towers equipped with searchlights and what appeared to be automated weapon systems monitored the perimeter. Most telling of all, massive air conditioning units and ventilation systems indicated that whatever was happening here required significant life support infrastructure. Karen set up the ground-penetrating radar while Eli photographed everything he could see from their concealed position. The radar readings revealed the truth. Beneath the modest surface facilities lay a complex that extended at least 5 levels underground, with enough space to house thousands of people for extended periods. "My God," Eli whispered as he studied the readouts. "It's like an underground city." "One of at least 6 that we know of," Karen replied. "And this is just what they're building in Wyoming and Montana. Intelligence suggests similar facilities are under construction throughout the western United States." As they packed up their equipment, Eli felt a mixture of vindication and terror. They now had proof that the government was secretly preparing for a Yellowstone eruption, while publicly denying any threat existed. But they also had evidence of a conspiracy so vast and well-funded that challenging it openly would be tantamount to suicide. The drive back to Gardner was tense and quiet. Both of them understood that they'd crossed a line tonight, moving from passive observation to active intelligence gathering. The people behind the conspiracy would not tolerate this kind of direct surveillance for long. Karen was right to be worried. Unknown to either of them, their activities had been monitored by satellite surveillance systems designed to detect exactly this kind of unauthorized reconnaissance. Facial recognition algorithms had identified them both, and their vehicle's license plate had been flagged in law enforcement databases across the region. Within hours, orders would be issued for their immediate apprehension and detention. The conspiracy had decided that Karen Holt and Eli Grant had become too dangerous to remain free. But first, they had to be isolated from any support networks or escape routes. The plan that had been set in motion would ensure that when they disappeared, no one would think to look for them until it was far too late to matter. Chapter 5. The Smoking Gun. Secure conference room, undisclosed location, August 3rd, 2017. The recording device was smaller than a matchbox, designed to look like a routine equipment monitoring sensor of the type found throughout government facilities. Eli had placed it in the ventilation system of conference room C7 3 hours earlier, using his maintenance access codes to enter the secure wing of the Denver Federal Building. What he captured on that device would become the smoking gun that proved everything he'd suspected about the Yellowstone conspiracy. The voices on the recording were clearly identifiable. Deputy Director Webb from FEMA, Assistant Secretary of Interior Patricia Vance, and at least 2 other officials whose identities Eli couldn't immediately determine. Their conversation was conducted with the casual tone of people who believed they were speaking in complete privacy. "The latest projections show we're ahead of schedule," Webb's voice came through clearly. "Thermal expansion in the Norris sector is accelerating faster than the models predicted." "How much faster?" Vance asked. 18 to 24 months ahead of the original timeline. We may be looking at a 2029 event rather than 2031. The sound of papers shuffling was audible before another voice joined the conversation. "The infrastructure projects are proceeding on schedule, but we'll need to accelerate the relocation of essential personnel if the timeline has moved up." "What about public disclosure?" Vance asked. Webb's laugh was bitter. "Public disclosure remains a non-option. We've run every scenario through the simulation models. Even with a full year of advance warning, we couldn't evacuate more than 15% of the affected population. The interstate system would collapse within hours, supply chains would break down completely, and we'd face massive social unrest that would interfere with Tier 1 evacuation procedures." "So we maintain the current posture?" "We maintain the lie," Webb corrected. "Continue the public briefings about normal seismic activity. Continue dismissing online speculation as conspiracy theories. And most importantly, continue the media relationships that keep investigative journalists focused on other stories." Eli's hands trembled as he listened to the casual discussion of abandoning hundreds of millions of people to die. These weren't comic book villains plotting world domination. They were mid-level government bureaucrats who had decided that preserving their own lives and positions was more important than honouring their oath to serve the public. The recording continued with logistical discussions that were even more damning. Supply caches were being positioned at the underground facilities. Communication networks that would remain operational during and after the eruption were being tested. Even arrangements for maintaining genetic diversity in the post-eruption population were being planned with clinical efficiency. "What about the monitoring station personnel?" an unidentified voice asked. "Some of them are asking uncomfortable questions." "We're handling that," Webb replied. "Enhanced security protocols, selective information sharing, and when necessary, personnel reassignments to less sensitive positions." "What about the ones who have already seen too much?" "Problem solved," Webb's voice carried a note of finality that made Eli's stomach turn. "The park ranger who was asking questions about the deep bore project will be transferred to a remote station in Alaska next week. A routine reassignment that gets her away from Yellowstone and limits her access to sensitive information. Karen." They were talking about Karen, and Eli knew with sickening certainty that her reassignment would be permanent in ways that had nothing to do with Park Service bureaucracy. The meeting concluded with assignments and timelines that painted a clear picture of a conspiracy in its final phases. The underground facilities would be fully operational by 2028. Essential personnel would begin training exercises that were actually disguised evacuations by early 2029, and the public would remain completely unaware until the eruption made further secrecy impossible. Eli retrieved the recording device later that night, his heart pounding as he navigated the empty corridors of the federal building. The evidence he now possessed was explosive enough to bring down the entire conspiracy, if he could find a way to get it to journalists who couldn't be intimidated or discredited. But first he had to warn Karen about her impending reassignment. He tried calling her cell phone but got no answer. Her ranger station reported that she was off duty and couldn't be reached for routine inquiries. Growing increasingly worried, Eli drove to her apartment in Mammoth Hot Springs, only to find it dark and apparently empty. Karen's supervisor, when Eli finally tracked him down, was apologetic but unhelpful. "Officer Holt has been temporarily assigned to a special project in Alaska. She left this morning on a charter flight. Very sudden, but you know how it is with Park Service priorities." Eli knew exactly how it was. Karen Holt had become a liability, and liabilities were being eliminated with bureaucratic efficiency. Her disappearance was a warning and a preview of his own fate if he continued to threaten the conspiracy's operational security. That night, he uploaded the recording to multiple secure servers and began reaching out to investigative journalists whose work suggested they couldn't be easily intimidated. The evidence was now beyond their ability to suppress completely, but Eli understood that possessing it had made him the most dangerous man in America. He was no longer just a witness to the conspiracy. He was the only person outside their organization who could prove it existed, and that made him a target that couldn't be allowed to remain free. Chapter 6. The Countdown. Gardner, Montana, November 12, 2017. The email from ProPublica journalist Michael Chen arrived at 3:47 a.m, marked with encryption protocols that indicated he'd taken Eli's warnings about government surveillance seriously. The message was brief, but electrifying. Audio verified by 3 independent sources. Document analysis confirms authenticity. Ready to publish. Need secure meeting to discuss protection protocols. Eli had been living as a fugitive in his own life for 3 months, changing locations nightly and communicating only through encrypted channels. The strain was showing. He'd lost 20 pounds, developed chronic insomnia, and started checking his rearview mirror obsessively whenever he drove. But Chen's message confirmed that the months of careful evidence gathering had finally produced results that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. What Eli didn't know was that his encrypted communications had been compromised for weeks, and that every message he'd sent to journalists was being monitored by the same people he was trying to expose. The conspiracy's response was swift and multi-pronged. Within hours of Chen's message, every major news network received exclusive briefings from USGS officials debunking dangerous misinformation about Yellowstone. The briefings included carefully edited seismic data, testimonials from concerned scientists about the psychological damage caused by eruption rumours, and veiled threats about the national security implications of spreading geological panic. Chen's editor killed the story before it could be published. The official reason was insufficient corroboration from government sources. The real reason became clear when Chen contacted Eli through secure channels. ProPublica's major donors had received calls from federal officials suggesting that publishing unverified geological speculation could affect the organisation's non-profit status. But the conspiracy had underestimated the modern information landscape. Eli's evidence had been distributed to dozens of journalists, bloggers, and citizen researchers, while mainstream media outlets could be pressured into silence. The decentralised nature of online publishing made complete suppression impossible. On November the 15th, the story broke simultaneously across 17 different platforms. Independent journalists published the recordings. Geology professors confirmed the technical details. Former government employees provided additional context about the classified facilities. Within 48 hours, #Yellowstone Conspiracy was trending globally. The government's response was predictable and desperate. Official spokespeople dismissed the evidence as sophisticated disinformation designed to undermine public confidence in scientific institutions. The recordings were declared fabricated using advanced audio manipulation technology. Alternative explanations were provided for every piece of evidence Eli had gathered, but the dam had broken. Whistleblowers within the conspiracy began coming forward with additional documentation. Satellite images of the underground facilities appeared online. Construction workers who had built the secret bunkers shared their stories. Karen Holt, who had been held at a debriefing facility in Alaska, was released and immediately went public with her testimony about the Deep Bore project. The revelation that the government had been planning to abandon 300 million Americans to die while saving only a privileged few sparked the largest protests in American history. Demonstrations erupted in every major city. Congressional hearings were demanded. International allies expressed outrage at being kept in the dark about a disaster that would affect global climate and agriculture. Most importantly, real evacuation planning finally began. With the truth exposed, it became impossible to maintain the fiction that Yellowstone posed no threat. Scientists worked around the clock to develop actual emergency response procedures. International cooperation emerged as other countries offered to assist with evacuation and resettlement efforts. Chapter 7. The Final Message. Yellowstone National Park, January 20th, 2029. Eli stood on the Lamar Valley overlook, watching steam rise from thermal features that had doubled in intensity over the past 18 months. The park was nearly empty now. Evacuations had begun 6 months earlier when seismic activity had become impossible to hide. The animals had fled long ago, following instincts older than human civilization. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the Global Yellowstone Monitoring Consortium, an international scientific collaboration that had formed after the conspiracy's exposure. Seismic precursors accelerating. Event window now estimated at 72 to 96 hours. Final evacuation protocols activated. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same evidence that the conspiracy had tried to suppress for decades was now being used to save millions of lives. The underground facilities that had been built for a privileged few were being converted into evacuation centres for ordinary families. The communication networks designed to preserve government continuity were now coordinating the largest humanitarian operation in human history. Not everyone could be saved. The logistics were still overwhelming, but transparency had enabled genuine preparation instead of elite preservation. International agreements had been signed to relocate climate refugees. Agricultural systems had been modified to function with altered growing conditions. Supply chains had been restructured to survive massive disruption. Eli's satellite phone rang. Karen's voice came through clearly from her position at the Evacuation Coordination Center in Denver. "Final transport leaves Gardner in 30 minutes, she reported. "You need to be on it." "I'll be there," Eli replied, but he remained standing on the overlook for several more minutes. Below him, Yellowstone spread out in its terrible beauty, a landscape that had remained largely unchanged for thousands of years, about to be transformed by forces that made human concerns seem trivial. His phone's camera was still recording as he delivered his final message. "This is Eli Grant, reporting from Yellowstone National Park on January 20th, 2029. In approximately 3 days, this place will become ground zero for the largest volcanic eruption in human history. But unlike the conspiracy originally planned, this won't be a secret apocalypse that kills hundreds of millions while saving a few thousand elites. Because the truth came out, we've had time to prepare. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. The people fleeing this region know what's coming and why. The international community is ready to help. The aftermath will be terrible, but it won't be hidden, and it won't be used to justify abandoning the principles of democratic society. If you're watching this from the future, remember that transparency saved lives. Remember that ordinary people, when given truth instead of lies, are capable of extraordinary cooperation. And remember that the greatest disasters are always made worse by the people who try to profit from them instead of preventing them." As he walked back to his truck for the final drive to the evacuation point, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not for avoiding the catastrophe, that was beyond human power to prevent, but hope that when the crisis came, humanity would face it together rather than divided by the lies of those who valued their own survival above everyone else's. Epilogue: The Quiet After the Storm. New Geneva, International Reconstruction Zone, January 20th, 2034. 5 years after the Yellowstone eruption, Eli Grant stood before the International Truth and Reconciliation Commission, delivering testimony that would help ensure such a conspiracy could never again threaten global security. The hearing was being broadcast live to millions of survivors in refugee communities across 6 continents. The eruption had been as devastating as predicted. Ash fallout had disrupted global agriculture for 3 years. Climate patterns had shifted dramatically, and large areas of North America remained uninhabitable. But because the truth had emerged in time, the disaster had brought out humanity's cooperative instincts rather than its destructive ones. The Yellowstone conspiracy taught us that the greatest threats to human survival aren't natural disasters. Eli concluded his testimony. They're the institutions that respond to those disasters by protecting themselves at the expense of everyone else. Transparency isn't just an ideal, it's a survival strategy. In the audience, Karen Holt nodded her approval. She now directed the Global Early Warning Network, an international organisation dedicated to ensuring that geological threats could never again be hidden from the public. Around the world, the underground facilities originally built for elite preservation had been converted into research stations, museums, and memorials dedicated to democratic accountability. The Yellowstone conspiracy had been exposed just in time to save millions of lives, but more importantly, it had revealed the difference between a society that prepares for disaster together and one that allows the powerful to abandon everyone else when crisis strikes. As Eli walked out of the hearing room into the rebuilt world beyond, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones we tell ourselves we're keeping for everyone's own good. The truth, no matter how terrifying, is always preferable to a lie that serves only the few at the expense of the many. What if the most powerful secret society in history wasn't the Illuminati, the Knights Templar, or even the modern Freemasons, but three men whose names have been deliberately erased from every record? Tonight, we dive deep into the digital shadows to uncover a conspiracy so intricate, so carefully hidden, that discovering it might be the last thing you ever do. Before we begin, what conspiracy would you like us to investigate next? Ancient bloodlines controlling world governments, the real purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even darker lurking in the depths of the internet? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories for more late-night investigations that will keep you awake long after the credits roll. The blue glow of Dorian Cade's monitors cast long shadows across his cluttered apartment at 3:47 a.m. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his workstation, where 4 screens displayed cascading lines of encrypted data. This was his domain, the digital underworld where secrets lived and died in streams of code. Dorian had always been drawn to the spaces between spaces, the forgotten corners of the internet where truth hid behind layers of encryption. By day, he was just another cybersecurity analyst for Titan Defense Systems, debugging firewalls and hunting malware. But by night, he was something else entirely, a digital archaeologist, excavating buried information from the deepest recesses of the web. Tonight's target was a seemingly innocuous file archive he'd discovered on a defunct server that once belonged to the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. The files were old, some dating back to the early digitization efforts of the 1990s, when historical documents were first being converted from physical to digital formats. Most of it was mundane: meeting minutes, membership rolls, financial records, the kind of material that would put most people to sleep. But Dorian wasn't most people. As his decryption algorithms worked through the data, something unusual caught his attention. Buried within a folder labelled Historical Correspondence MISC was a file that didn't match the others. The metadata was wrong, the encryption was different, and when he finally cracked it open, what he found made his pulse quicken. It was a single image, a symbol he had never seen before. 3 interlocked triangles formed an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision. Each triangle was perfectly equilateral, but where they intersected, strange geometric forms emerged, creating an optical illusion that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Beneath the symbol was a single line of text, the triune accord established. 1717 AVCRJH. Dorian leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against his desk. 1717. That was the same year the Grand Lodge of London was established, marking the beginning of organised Freemasonry. But what was the Triune Accord, and who were AV, CR and JH? He screenshotted the image and began reverse searching it through every database he could access. Nothing. No matches, no similar images, no references anywhere on the indexed internet. It was as if this symbol existed in a void, completely disconnected from the digital world. The mystery deepened when he examined the file's digital signature. According to the metadata, this document had been accessed and modified hundreds of times over the past 30 years, but always by anonymous users with no traceable digital footprints. Someone, or multiple someones, had been maintaining this file, keeping it alive in the digital space while ensuring it remained invisible to casual observers. Dorian's hands moved instinctively to his keyboard. He had found something that wasn't supposed to be found, touched something that wasn't supposed to be touched. And now, he couldn't let it go. The hunt had begun. 3 days of relentless searching had yielded fragments, tantalizing pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. Dorian had barely slept, surviving on caffeine and the electric thrill of discovery. His apartment had transformed into a conspiracy theorist's dream, with printed documents taped to every available wall surface, and red string connecting seemingly random data points. The breakthrough came when he cross-referenced the initials AV, CR, and JH with historical Masonic records from the early 18th century. Traditional sources yielded nothing, but when he dug into the darker corners of academic databases, forgotten doctoral dissertations, obscure historical journals, private collections that had been digitized but never properly indexed, patterns began to emerge. In a 1987 thesis on esoteric influences in early American politics, he found a footnote referencing 3 mysterious benefactors who had allegedly provided funding for the construction of several early American government buildings. The author had dismissed the claims as unsubstantiated rumours, but had noted that the same 3 sets of initials appeared in financial records from Philadelphia, Boston and Charleston between 1720 and 1750. A deeper dive into banking archives from the period revealed something extraordinary. Dorian discovered a series of encrypted letters between European aristocrats and early American colonists, all revolving around something called the doctrine of quiet influence. The letters, written in a cipher that had taken him 2 full days to crack, described a methodology for guiding human behaviour through subtle manipulation of symbols, language, and social structures. But it was the names that made his blood run cold. The letters were signed with the same initials, AV, CR, and JH. According to the correspondence, these 3 men weren't just wealthy benefactors. They were the architects of a new form of power, one that didn't rely on armies or political office, but on the manipulation of human psychology itself. They had studied the old mystery schools, the ancient techniques of persuasion and control, and had adapted them for a new age. One letter, dated 1734, was particularly chilling. The masses believe they choose their own thoughts, their own desires, their own leaders. They do not understand that choice itself can be manufactured, shaped like clay in the hands of those who understand the deeper mechanics of the human mind. We 3 have laid the foundation stones. Future generations will build upon our work without ever knowing our names. Dorian printed out the letter and pinned it to his wall next to the symbol of the 3 interlocked triangles. The pattern was starting to make sense. These weren't just random geometric shapes. They were a visual representation of the 3 founders' methodology. Each triangle represented a different sphere of influence: political, economic, and cultural. Where they intersected, control was established. But who were they? The initials were all he had to go on, and despite hours of searching, he couldn't find any historical figures from the period whose names matched. It was as if they had been deliberately erased from the historical record. That's when he made his second major discovery. Hidden within the financial records was a reference to something called the Lodge of 3 Pillars. Not an official Masonic lodge, but what appeared to be a secret organisation within the larger Masonic structure. The 3 pillars, according to the documents, were AV, CR, and JH themselves. Dorian's excitement was tempered by a growing sense of unease. He was uncovering something that had been buried for nearly 3 centuries, something that powerful people had gone to great lengths to hide. The deeper he dug, the more he realised that this wasn't just history. It was a blueprint, a framework that was still being used. As the sun rose over the city, casting golden light through his apartment windows, Dorian stared at the wall of evidence he had assembled. The 3 Masons, as he had begun calling them, had created more than just a secret society. They had engineered a system of control that devolved and adapted over centuries, invisible but omnipresent. And now he was beginning to understand how it worked. The realization hit Dorian like a physical blow as he sat in his favourite coffee shop, laptop open, surrounded by the mundane chatter of the morning commuters. He had been analysing media patterns for the past week, looking for connections to the doctrine of quiet influence, when the data suddenly cohered into a terrifying picture. It was everywhere. The 3 interlocked triangles, the symbol of the triune accord, weren't just hidden in dusty historical archives. They were embedded in the fabric of modern culture, disguised and abstracted but unmistakably present. Movie logos, corporate brands, architectural designs, even the layout of popular websites, all contained subtle variations of the 3-triangle pattern. Dorian's hand shook as he scrolled through his analysis. He had developed an algorithm to detect geometric patterns that matched the mathematical relationships inherent in the original symbol. The results were overwhelming. Major Hollywood studios, Fortune 500 companies, news networks and social media platforms all incorporated elements of the design into their visual identity. But it went deeper than logos and branding. The doctrine of quiet influence, as described in the 18th century letters, relied on three key principles: repetition, authority, and emotional resonance. Dorian began to see these principles reflected in everything from political campaigns to advertising strategies to social media algorithms. The coffee in his cup grew cold as he dove deeper into the pattern recognition data. Primetime television shows contained dialogue structures that followed specific linguistic patterns outlined in the historical documents. Popular songs used chord progressions and lyrical frameworks that aligned with the emotional manipulation techniques described in the letters. Even children's programming seemed to incorporate subliminal messaging systems derived from the Three Masons' psychological frameworks. The most disturbing discovery came when he analysed news broadcasts from the past decade. Major networks, regardless of their political orientation, used nearly identical linguistic structures when reporting on controversial topics. The language was designed to create emotional responses that bypassed rational analysis, exactly as the doctrine had prescribed. Dorian closed his laptop and walked home in a daze. His apartment felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge he carried. Every advertisement on the subway, every billboard along the street, every notification on his phone, they all looked different through the lens of what he now understood. That evening he began compiling a comprehensive digital archive of his findings. If what he suspected was true, if the Three Masons' influence had not only survived but thrived in the modern era, then someone needed to document it. He created encrypted backups of everything: the historical documents, his analysis algorithms, the pattern recognition data, his own notes and theories. As he worked, a new question haunted him. If the Three Masons had successfully embedded their control systems into modern society, who was running those systems now? The original architects had died centuries ago, but their work lived on. Someone was maintaining it, updating it, ensuring its continued effectiveness. Dorian pulled up recent financial records from some of the corporations that featured the strongest pattern matches. Shell companies, offshore accounts, anonymous investors. The ownership structures were labyrinthine, designed to obscure rather than reveal. But patterns emerged here too. The same investment firms appeared again and again, the same legal structures, the same carefully anonymized board members. It was a network, vast and interconnected, spanning industries and continents, and at its heart, Dorian was beginning to suspect, were the modern inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. He named his archive the Veil Project and began preparing it for release. The world had a right to know about the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, but as he prepared to upload his findings to multiple whistleblower platforms, his computer screen flickered. For just a moment, the three interlocked triangles appeared in the corner of his monitor. There and gone so quickly, he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Almost. The message appeared in Dorian's private encrypted chat channel at 2:33 a.m, exactly 72 hours after he had discovered the pattern recognition data. The sender was listed as anonymous, but the message itself was anything but anonymous. It was clearly directed at him, containing details that only someone who had been watching his research could know. The three still watch. Stop now, Dorian. Dorian stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He had been so careful, using multiple layers of encryption, routing his traffic through a dozen different proxy servers, maintaining operational security that should have made him invisible to all but the most sophisticated surveillance operations. But they had found him. He ran a full system scan, checking for malware, backdoors, any sign of compromise. His security software came back clean, but Dorian knew that meant nothing. If someone had the resources to track his research, despite his precautions, they would also have the resources to hide their presence on his system. The paranoia began slowly, like a low-grade fever. Every notification on his phone made him jump. Every knock on his apartment door sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. He started noticing things that might have been coincidences. The same car parked outside his building for 3 days, a man in a coffee shop who looked away too quickly when Dorian glanced in his direction. The second message arrived 48 hours later, this time containing a photograph. It showed Dorian sitting at his computer, taken from inside his own apartment. The timestamp indicated it had been captured the previous night while he worked on the Veil project. Someone had been inside his home. Dorian immediately conducted a physical sweep of his apartment. He found the device hidden inside the frame of his bedroom mirror. A microcamera so small he almost missed it, connected to a transmitter that was broadcasting his every move to an unknown receiver. But the camera was just the beginning. A more thorough search revealed audio pickups in his kitchen and living room, keystroke loggers attached to his computer equipment, and something that looked like a network tap spliced into his Ethernet cable. His entire life was being monitored. The rational part of his mind told him to stop, to destroy his research and return to his normal life. But Dorian had never been particularly rational. The invasion of his privacy, rather than deterring him, only confirmed that he was onto something significant. You didn't deploy military-grade surveillance equipment against someone who was chasing shadows. He began operating under the assumption that everything he did was being watched. He established new research protocols, using air-gapped computers and physical storage devices that never connected to the internet. He moved his most sensitive work to a storage unit across town, accessible only by physical key. He varied his routines, took different routes to work, paid for everything in cash, but the watchers adapted too. His work computer at Titan Defense Systems began experiencing mysterious glitches. Files would disappear and reappear. His security clearance was subjected to routine reviews that felt anything but routine. Colleagues who had been friendly for years suddenly seemed distant, their conversations stilted and careful. The third message was different. Instead of a text, he received a link to a news article about a cybersecurity researcher in Seattle who had died in a car accident. The researcher, according to the article, had been working on sensitive projects related to digital privacy and surveillance. The accident had occurred at 3:17 a.m. on a straight stretch of highway, with no other vehicles involved. Dorian noticed that the timestamp on the article was exactly 3 minutes before he received the link. The message was clear: this could happen to you. But by then, Dorian was too deep to surface. The Veil project had expanded beyond his original scope, becoming an obsession that consumed his waking hours and invaded his dreams. He had uncovered something that went beyond historical curiosity or academic research. The Three Masons weren't just a fascinating historical footnote, they were the architects of a system that was still actively shaping human society. And someone was willing to kill to keep that secret hidden. That night, Dorian made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to silence him, they would have to find him first. He began preparations for what he called Project Deep Dive, a final comprehensive investigation that would either expose the truth about the Three Masons or confirm his own paranoid delusions. Either way, he would have his answer. As he packed his research materials and prepared to disappear into the digital underground, Dorian caught a glimpse of his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He looked like a man who had seen too much, learned too much, gone too far down a rabbit hole that might not have an exit. But he also looked like a man who was finally fully alive. The abandoned subway station beneath downtown had been closed since 1962, but Dorian's research had revealed that its tunnels connected to a network of service corridors that ran beneath several government buildings. More importantly, the location offered something he desperately needed: complete isolation from digital surveillance. He had spent 3 days preparing his mobile command center. Military-grade Faraday cages protected his equipment from electronic monitoring. Satellite internet connections routed through multiple international proxies provided connectivity that would be nearly impossible to trace. Battery packs and portable generators ensured he could operate for weeks without external power. The setup looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic thriller, and Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that it might represent his future. A life spent in the shadows, hunted by forces he barely understood. But it was here, in the depths beneath the city that he finally breached what he had come to think of as the vault. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While analysing the financial networks he had discovered, Dorian noticed that several key transactions were processed through a server cluster housed in the Smithsonian Institution's digital archive facility. The Smithsonian servers weren't just repositories for historical documents. They were hosting active financial systems for the network of corporations connected to the Three Masons pattern. Using exploit tools from his defence contractor days, Dorian tunnelled into the archive system through a maintenance portal that had been forgotten during a security update. What he found inside defied his wildest expectations. The vault wasn't a single database, it was an entire hidden internet, a shadow network that existed parallel to the visible web. Accessible only through specific cryptographic keys that appeared to be distributed to a select group of users, the vault contained terabytes of data spanning 3 centuries. The most recent files were mind-bending. Detailed psychological profiles of world leaders, media manipulation strategies updated in real time, algorithmic frameworks for managing public opinion through social media platforms. But it was the historical archives that truly shocked him. Digitized manuscripts described secret chambers beneath Washington, D.C., built during the Capitol's construction according to specifications provided by the Three Masons. The chambers weren't just meeting spaces. They were designed as psychological amplification devices, using acoustic engineering and symbolic geometry to enhance the persuasive power of those who spoke within them. Architectural drawings showed that the entire layout of the Capitol building, the White House, and the Supreme Court formed a massive version of the 3 interlocked triangles when viewed from above. The buildings weren't just symbols of American democracy, they were active components in a system designed to channel and focus political influence. But the most disturbing documents dealt with something called the Great Work, an ongoing project to gradually reshape human consciousness through systematic manipulation of culture, education, and information systems. The Great Work wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was presented as a form of guided evolution, helping humanity develop according to principles established by the Three Masons. According to the documents, every major social movement of the past 2 centuries had been either initiated or co-opted by the inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. Wars, revolutions, technological breakthroughs, cultural shifts, all were pieces in a vast game being played by invisible hands. And Dorian discovered that modern political speeches were crafted using linguistic frameworks, derived directly from the original doctrine of quiet influence. Presidential debates, congressional hearings, Supreme Court arguments, all followed scripted patterns designed to produce predetermined emotional responses in viewers. Entertainment media was even more thoroughly controlled. Hollywood studios, record labels, publishing houses, all were connected to the network through complex ownership structures. Popular culture wasn't a reflection of society's values. It was a tool for shaping those values. As Dorian delved deeper into the vault, he began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just a historical conspiracy. It was a living system, constantly evolving and adapting to new technologies and social conditions. The Three Masons had died centuries ago, but their work lived on through institutions, traditions, and methodologies that had become so embedded in society that they were virtually invisible. The most chilling realization came when he discovered his own file in the vault's database. They had been monitoring him for months, tracking his research, analysing his psychological profile, preparing countermeasures. His investigation hadn't been a secret quest for truth. It had been a carefully observed experiment. But why let him discover so much? Why allow him to penetrate their most sensitive archives? The answer came in a document titled Protocol 7, Asset Integration. Dorian's blood ran cold as he read the clinical assessment of his psychological profile, his motivations, his likely responses to various stimuli. He wasn't just a threat to be eliminated, he was a potential asset to be recruited. The file indicated that his research skills and psychological profile made him an ideal candidate for voluntary integration into their network. His investigation of the Three Masons hadn't been a violation of their security, It had been an audition. As this understanding washed over him, Dorian noticed something that made his hands shake. The documents he was accessing contained metadata signatures, hidden markers that traced every query back to his specific location and identity. By exploring the vault, he wasn't just learning their secrets, he was leaving digital fingerprints that proved he had been there. The final piece of the puzzle revealed itself at 4:47 a.m. on what Dorian would later realise was his last night of freedom. He had been analysing the most recent uploads to the vault, real-time data feeds that showed the Three Masons' influence network in active operation. What he discovered was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The network wasn't just influencing culture and politics, it was actively shaping reality itself through coordinated manipulation of information systems. Social media algorithms were tweaked to promote specific narratives. Search engine results were subtly adjusted to guide public research toward predetermined conclusions. News recommendation systems were programmed to create echo chambers that reinforced desired belief patterns. But the most sophisticated element was something they called consensus engineering. By carefully managing the flow of information across multiple platforms simultaneously, the network could create the illusion that certain ideas were organically emerging from grassroots movements, when in fact they were being systematically planted and cultivated. Dorian watched in real time as a coordinated information campaign was launched across dozens of platforms. A political controversy that would dominate news cycles for weeks was being artificially created through carefully timed leaks, strategic social media posts, and coordinated commentary from influencers who probably didn't even realise they were part of the operation. The level of coordination was staggering. Television networks, newspapers, social media platforms, and even individual bloggers were all receiving talking points through channels that appeared unconnected but were actually part of a single centralised command structure. He began documenting everything, screenshotting real-time operations, copying database entries, building an irrefutable record of the network in action. This was the smoking gun he had been looking for, proof that modern society was being manipulated by invisible forces operating on a scale that dwarfed anything in history. But as he prepared to copy the most damaging files to his secure storage devices, Dorian noticed something that made his blood freeze. The documents he was accessing contained more than just information. They contained active code that was executing on his system every time he opened a file. He ran an immediate diagnostic and discovered the horrifying truth. Every document in the vault was embedded with sophisticated tracking malware. Not only did the system know exactly what he had accessed, it had been installing backdoors and surveillance tools on his equipment from the moment he had first breached their security. His air-gapped computers weren't air-gapped anymore. His encrypted storage devices were compromised. His Faraday cages were useless against software that was already inside his systems. But the worst revelation was yet to come. As he traced the malware's network connections, Dorian realised that his entire investigation had been orchestrated from the beginning. The original files he had discovered in the Masonic Lodge archive. They had been placed there deliberately, designed to attract someone with his specific skill set and psychological profile. The research trails he had followed, the connections he had discovered, the patterns he had uncovered, all of it had been a carefully constructed puzzle, leading him step by step to this moment. He hadn't been investigating the Three Masons, he had been recruited by them. The recruitment wasn't complete yet. According to the protocols he found in his own file, the final step required a conscious choice. He could accept integration into their network, becoming a willing participant in the great work, or he could face the consequences of possessing knowledge that wasn't meant for outsiders. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new message appeared on his screen. Dorian, you have seen behind the veil. There are only two paths forward. Choose wisely. Below the message were two links. The first was labelled integration. The second was labelled termination. Dorian stared at the screen, his mind racing through the implications of everything he had discovered. The Three Masons weren't the villains in this story, at least not from their perspective. They saw themselves as shepherds of human civilization, guiding society toward what they believed was a better future. The manipulation, the control, the systematic shaping of human consciousness, all of it was presented as necessary stewardship of a species too chaotic and self-destructive to govern itself effectively. But Dorian couldn't shake the image of humanity as a vast puppet show, with invisible hands pulling strings that the puppets couldn't even see. Was guided evolution really better than free will? Was managed consciousness preferable to authentic chaos? The choice before him wasn't just about his own survival. It was about what kind of world he wanted to live in, and what kind of person he wanted to be within that world. As he reached for his mouse to make his selection, Dorian heard something that made his blood run cold. Sirens in the distance, growing closer. Time was up. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel above was unmistakable. Heavy boots, moving with military precision, getting closer with each passing second. Dorian's hands flew across his keyboard as he initiated emergency protocols, wiping drives, destroying evidence, preparing for what he now realized was inevitable. The sirens had been a psychological prompt designed to create urgency and force a hasty decision. The real trap was much more elegant than simple law enforcement intervention. As Dorian frantically tried to secure his data, he discovered that his internet connection had been severed, not blocked, completely terminated at the infrastructure level. His backup satellite connections were jammed. His cellular network showed full signal strength but couldn't establish data connections. Even his emergency radio beacon was transmitting into empty air, its signals absorbed by sophisticated countermeasures he couldn't detect, but could feel pressing in around him like invisible walls. The isolation was complete and professional. Whoever was coming for him had surrounded him not just physically, but digitally, cutting off every possible avenue of communication or escape. But Dorian had one final card to play. Before establishing his underground command center, he had prepared a dead man's switch, an automated system that would release his entire archive if he failed to check in within a specific time window. The system was housed on a server cluster in Eastern Europe, completely disconnected from his current location and impossible to trace back to him through conventional means. At least that's what he had believed. As he tried to access the dead man's switch, Dorian discovered that it too had been compromised. The activation codes had been changed, the server locations had been altered, and his backup authentication systems had been systematically disabled. Somehow they had anticipated and countered even his most paranoid contingency plans. The footsteps stopped directly above his hiding place. In the silence that followed, Dorian finally understood the true nature of the trap. He hadn't just been recruited, he had been studied, analysed, and predicted with mechanical precision. Every move he had made, every precaution he had taken, every paranoid contingency he had prepared, had been anticipated and accounted for. His investigation hadn't been a threat to their operations. It had been a demonstration of their capabilities. A voice echoed down from the tunnel above, calm and professional. "Mr. Cade, we need to talk." Dorian looked around his underground command center. The sophisticated equipment, the military-grade security measures, the careful preparations that had taken weeks to implement. All of it was useless now. He had been allowed to build this fortress so that they could demonstrate how easily it could be bypassed. The voice continued, "Your research has been impressive. Your skills are exactly what we've been looking for. But the recruitment process needs to be completed according to protocol." Protocol. Everything with them was protocol, systematic and methodical. Even rebellion had to follow their rules, serve their purposes, advance their agenda. As the first figures began descending into his underground sanctuary, Dorian made one final desperate attempt to access his archive. If he could just upload something, anything, to prove that the three Masons were real and active, maybe someone else would continue the investigation. But his screens had already gone dark. His equipment was shutting down in sequence, responding to override commands that bypassed every security system he had installed. They weren't just capturing him, they were demonstrating complete dominance over his digital domain. The lead figure removed their helmet, revealing a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a patient smile. She looked more like a librarian than a Black Ops operative. but her presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Hello, Dorian," she said warmly. "My name is Dr. Ellen Drew, and I represent the contemporary stewards of the great work. You've impressed us greatly with your research, but I'm afraid you've also created a security situation that needs to be resolved." Dorian found his voice. "You mean eliminated?" Dr. Drew shook her head. "Integration, actually. Your psychological profile suggests you'd be much more valuable as a willing participant than as a cautionary tale. The choice is still yours, but I should mention that the termination option from earlier was never really on the table. We've invested too much in your development to waste that potential." As she spoke, Dorian realised that even his moment of apparent choice had been an illusion. The integration process had already begun the moment he first accessed their files. Every revelation, every discovery, every moment of apparent rebellion had been carefully orchestrated to bring him to this point. He wasn't being recruited, he was being harvested. Dr. Drew gestured to the equipment surrounding them. "All of this will be preserved, of course. Your research will continue, but with proper resources and institutional support. The Three Masons' work is too important to be left to individual initiative, no matter how talented." Dorian stared at the woman who held his future in her hands. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be experiencing a very realistic simulation of refusal, while your consciousness is gradually adjusted to accept integration. We've found that the illusion of choice makes the process more comfortable for everyone involved. The trap was perfect because it had no exit. Resistance would be futile because resistance was part of the design. Even this conversation, even his growing horror at the situation, was probably being factored into some psychological algorithm designed to optimize his eventual compliance." As the implication sank in, Dorian felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, but his attachment to the idea that any of this had ever been real. His investigation, his discoveries, his moment of revelation, all of it had been a carefully crafted performance designed to transform him into whatever they needed him to become. The Three Masons weren't just controlling society, they were controlling him. And the most terrifying part was that he was beginning to understand why. 6 months after Dorian Cade disappeared from his apartment in the middle of the night, fragments of his research began surfacing on obscure internet forums. Anonymous uploads appeared on file-sharing networks, containing encrypted archives that told a story of conspiracy and control spanning 3 centuries. The uploads were sporadic and seemingly random. A few documents here, some analysis there, portions of what appeared to be a larger investigation into something called the Three Masons. The files generated intense discussion in certain corners of the internet. Conspiracy theorists, digital privacy advocates, and researchers into esoteric history all found elements that resonated with their particular interests. But the fragments raised more questions than they answered. The documentation was sophisticated enough to suggest serious research, but incomplete enough to prevent any definitive conclusions. The historical elements were intriguingly plausible, but unverifiable through conventional sources. The contemporary analysis contained insights into media manipulation and social control that seemed prescient, but could easily be dismissed as paranoid speculation. Some investigators tried to trace the uploads back to their source, but the digital trails led nowhere. The files appeared and disappeared from servers around the world, uploaded by anonymous accounts that vanished as quickly as they had been created. Whoever was releasing this information had sophisticated technical capabilities and an intimate understanding of how to remain invisible in the digital landscape. The mystery deepened when researchers noticed that the archive fragments contained embedded metadata, hidden signatures that seemed to reference additional materials that had never been released. The signatures suggested that what they were seeing was only a small portion of a much larger collection of evidence. But where was the rest of the archive? And who was controlling its release? Theories proliferated across discussion forums and social media platforms. Some believed that Dorian Cade had been silenced by the very forces he was investigating, and that the leaked materials were being released by automated systems he had established as insurance. Others suggested that the entire thing was an elaborate alternate reality game, designed to blur the lines between fiction and reality. A few researchers claimed to have identified patterns in the release schedule that aligned with significant political events or cultural developments. The fragments seemed to appear at moments when they would have maximum relevance to current affairs, as if someone was curating their release to maximise impact. But perhaps the most unsettling theory was that the leaks were intentional, not the work of a whistleblower or an automated system, but a deliberate information campaign designed to achieve some larger purpose. If the three Masons really existed, and if they really controlled information systems as thoroughly as the document suggested, then wouldn't they also control the narrative of their own exposure? Late-night researchers who delved too deeply into the Cade archive reported strange experiences, computer glitches that seemed too targeted to be random, internet searches that returned results that disappeared when accessed again, social media algorithms that seemed to actively suppress discussion of certain topics. Some claimed to have received anonymous messages warning them away from the investigation. Others reported that their research was being monitored by unknown parties. A few simply stopped posting one day, their accounts going silent without explanation. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Those who got closest to understanding the true scope of Dorian's discoveries seemed to encounter obstacles that discouraged further research. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by coincidence or technical malfunction. But the cumulative effect was to ensure that the investigation never reached critical mass. And so the mystery of Dorian Cade and the three Masons remained unsolved, existing in the liminal space between truth and fiction, between revelation and misdirection. The fragments continued to circulate, generating discussion and debate, but never quite coalescing into anything that could definitively prove or disprove the central claims. The most dedicated researchers began to notice something peculiar about their own investigations. The deeper they dug, the more they found themselves questioning not just the truth of Dorian's discoveries, but the nature of truth itself. If information could be so thoroughly controlled and manipulated, how could anyone be certain that their own thoughts and conclusions were authentic? One researcher, posting under the username Digital Veil, claimed to have reconstructed portions of Dorian's methodology and arrived at similar conclusions about media manipulation and social control. But when other investigators tried to verify the research, they found that the evidence cited by Digital Veil led to websites that no longer existed, documents that had been removed from archives, and source materials that seemed to vanish whenever anyone tried to access them independently. Was Digital Veil continuing Dorian's work? Or was Digital Veil part of the very system Dorian had claimed to expose? The question became even more complex when Digital Veil began posting increasingly sophisticated analysis that seemed to predict social and political developments with uncanny accuracy. The posts described how specific news events would unfold, how public opinion would shift in response to carefully crafted messaging campaigns, and how seemingly unrelated cultural phenomena were actually coordinated elements of larger influence operations. And the predictions kept coming true. But rather than proving the existence of the Three Masons conspiracy, Digital Veil's accurate predictions only deepened the mystery. Were they based on genuine insider knowledge of how the system operated, or were they simply the result of careful observation of existing patterns? Was Digital Veil exposing the conspiracy or participating in it? The final post from Digital Veil came exactly 1 year after Dorian Cade's disappearance. It consisted of a single image, the three interlocked triangles that had started Dorian's investigation, accompanied by a brief message. The research continues. The watchers become the watched. The hunters become the hunted. Truth is not a destination but a journey, and some journeys are designed to change the traveller more than the destination. Dorian understood this in the end. He chose integration not because he was forced to, but because he realised that the only way to truly oppose the system was to understand it from within. The Three Masons were never the enemy. They were teachers, waiting for students ready to learn the hardest lesson of all. Power is not something you take. Power is something you become. The archive is complete, the circle is closed, the great work continues. DK. The message sparked intense debate across conspiracy forums and research communities. Was this really from Dorian Cade, suggesting that he had willingly joined the organisation he had been investigating? Was it a fake message designed to discredit his research? Or was it something more subtle, a coded communication from someone operating deep within the system Dorian had tried to expose? No one could agree on the interpretation, and perhaps that was the point. The message was designed to be ambiguous, to raise questions rather than answer them, to ensure that the investigation would continue but never reach a definitive conclusion. In the months that followed, the Dorian Cade archive gradually faded from active discussion. New conspiracy theories emerged to capture the attention of digital investigators. New mysteries arose to challenge those who sought hidden truths. The three Masons, if they existed, returned to the shadows where they had always operated most effectively. But for those who had followed the investigation closely, something had changed. They found themselves looking at the world differently, noticing patterns they had never seen before, questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine. They began to see the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, even if they couldn't prove its existence to others. Some researchers reported that they had begun to incorporate elements of the doctrine of quiet influence into their own work, not to manipulate others, but to better understand how they themselves were being manipulated. They studied the psychological techniques described in Dorian's files, the linguistic frameworks, the symbolic systems, the methodologies for shaping human consciousness. A few claim to have achieved a kind of immunity to mass manipulation through this understanding. They described a state of hyper-awareness where they could observe the influence systems operating around them without being affected by them. They called it seeing through the veil. But others wondered if this supposed immunity was itself an illusion, if the system was sophisticated enough to make people believe they had escaped its influence, while actually drawing them deeper into its web. After all, what better way to control someone than to convince them they couldn't be controlled? The question that haunted all serious researchers into the Dorian Cade mystery was whether the investigation had revealed the truth about hidden systems of control, or whether it had been a demonstration of those systems in action. Had they uncovered a conspiracy, or had they been recruited into one? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility was that there was no meaningful difference between the two options. The final entry in what researchers believed to be Dorian's original archive was a single text file, uploaded anonymously to a dozen different platforms simultaneously. It contained no metadata, no digital signatures, no clues about its origin. The message was brief but haunting. If you are reading this, you have already been chosen. The investigation never ends. It only changes investigators. Welcome to the great work. Your orientation will begin shortly. Below the message was a simple instruction. Look around you. Really look. The signs are everywhere, once you know how to see them. And indeed, those who followed the instruction began to notice things. Symbols in corporate logos that matched patterns from the historical documents. Linguistic structures in news broadcasts that aligned with psychological manipulation frameworks. Social media algorithms that seemed to nudge users towards specific conclusions without their awareness. The three Masons weren't hiding in the shadows. They were hiding in plain sight, their influence so thoroughly woven into the fabric of modern society that it had become invisible through ubiquity. They didn't need to silence investigators because they had created a world where the truth was indistinguishable from elaborate fiction. And perhaps that was the most elegant control system of all. A reality so thoroughly constructed that even those who glimpsed behind the veil couldn't be certain whether they had discovered the truth or been recruited to perpetuate a more sophisticated illusion. The three Masons, whether real or imagined, ancient or contemporary, had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had made the question of their existence irrelevant. In a world where information could be infinitely manipulated and human consciousness systematically shaped, the distinction between reality and carefully crafted narrative had ceased to matter. What mattered was the system itself, the vast, invisible architecture of influence that operated according to principles established centuries ago by three men whose names had been deliberately erased from history. They had created not just a secret society, but a new form of reality, one where truth was not discovered but constructed, where power was not seized but evolved, and where the ultimate conspiracy was the idea that conspiracies were necessary at all. In the end, Dorian Cade's investigation had revealed something far more profound than evidence of historical manipulation or contemporary control systems. It had revealed the fundamental malleability of human consciousness and the terrifying possibility that reality itself was subject to editing by those who understood the deeper mechanics of perception and belief. The three were not just in the past, they were here now, watching, guiding, shaping the very thoughts that their observers used to contemplate their existence. They had transcended the crude mechanics of conspiracy to achieve something approaching digital godhood, the power to define reality itself. And the most beautiful part of their design was that it didn't matter whether anyone believed in them or not. The system they had created was self-sustaining, self-correcting, and ultimately inescapable. The investigation was over, the great work continued, and somewhere in the space between digital shadows and physical reality, Dorian Cade smiled and began planning his next recruitment.